All right, I'd like to call to order the May 12, 2025 Mountlake Terrace Planning Commission meeting to order. Would you please take the roll?
Chair Batista.
Here.
Vice Chair Betcher.
Here.
Commissioner Wu.
Here.
Commissioner Landis.
Here.
Please note that Commissioner Morgan nor Commissioner Thompson, oh, never mind, they have both just signed in. Commissioner Morgan?
Hello, here.
For some reason, Commissioner Thompson cannot speak yet. I'm trying to figure that out.
Okay, we see her though, so
But
she's there.
she is here.
And then Commissioner Stenson has requested an emergency excused absence. Would anybody like to make a motion to excuse Commissioner Stenson tonight?
Motion to excuse Commissioner Stenson tonight.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Seconded.
I have a motion and a second to excuse Commissioner Stenson from tonight's meeting. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, hearing none, that motion carries. Commissioner Stenson has an excused absence for tonight. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, approval of the April 14th, 2025 meeting minutes. Does anybody have any changes or corrections? I am not hearing or seeing any, so we'll go ahead and declare those accepted as presented. Item number 4, public comment. Let the record show there is no public in attendance tonight. Did we have anybody who signed up to speak online?
No one has signed up to speak online, nor requested a comment through email.
Okay, we'll move on to item number 5, review draft middle housing zoning and design standards and associated amendments.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all again. So we're back to talk more about the Middle Housing Planning Code update. And so the purpose of tonight's meeting is to seek guidance on the latest version of the draft standards, which should be in your packet. So the agenda for tonight's meeting is we'll quickly go over some developer feedback, talk through the bonuses and flexibilities in the code, the updated residential standards, focusing on the changes that have been made, and then also going through the parking standards and design standards, and then we'll close with talking about next steps over the next month as we work towards adoption. So I'll quickly talk about I would say developer interviews, but they were a handful of real estate professionals, some developers, some brokers, some development consultants, et cetera. And so the main findings here largely corroborated and also informed the changes that we'll be talking through tonight. So this is by no means the last time that you will be hearing about these concepts tonight. But what we really heard loud and clear was concerns that if ADUs count towards lot coverage or other standards that regulate the building size, it would limit the property owner's ability to expand or redevelop their home in the future. We also heard that subjective code standards add time and cost to projects, and so there was an emphasis on making sure that the code is both clear and straightforward, but also allows for flexibility for smaller developers. There was an emphasis as well that there's a market for smaller homes in Mountlake Terrace, especially for seniors, and that's an important part of a complete housing market and a desire to incentivize smaller units and smaller homes. And then finally, there was a discussion about also investing in some of the other infrastructure that attracts developers and buyers, things like transportation infrastructure, like sidewalks and bike lanes, as well as parks.
Okay, thank you, commissioners, for having us back. We'll talk about bonuses next. We'll start with what we've heard a little bit. We heard a lot of encouragement for community connections, An interest in sustainability, adding maybe bonuses for net zero or passive house, and a bit of height flexibility for photovoltaics. Talked about how to regulate bonus impervious surfaces. There's been strong support for cottage housing throughout our discussions. Echo Northwest mentioned reducing impact fees. And then there was also support for maybe doing a parking reduction tied to tree retention. City Council meeting on the 21st was really great and supportive. They were interested also in the connectivity flexibility, especially for seniors to promote walkability. And they were actually mentioned not against mandating it in the city center. That's not a part of this project, but there was enough support that in some cases they may be interested in the future of really saying where those need to go. They also asked to get feedback from developers on what they would need to make tree retention and connections feasible. I'm actually going to start with the sustainability one today. So we've revised this one quite a bit. We heard you wanted to incentivize those rating systems, so we're proposing an area bonus for buildings designed, built, and certified with this list of sustainability systems or certifications. We pulled out our previous proposal that was really about allowing that thicker insulation within the setback because there's actually a new state law that says you have to allow that. So we could kind of take that out of the bonuses. And then we added the ability for photovoltaics to go in the height, above the height limit, just to the height section as an exception. And so really it's a simple sustainability bonus proposed at rewarding buildings that go after these rating systems. Okay. Moving into connections for a few slides, we heard a lot of support, as I mentioned. So the changes from last time are pretty minor. We clarified that these connections have to go from sidewalk to the rear lot line, which we hadn't written before. And then in talking with staff, we realized that 16 feet of width may be more achievable, so we've revised that down from 20 feet wide. And this is really suited to slots, right, where we often have a driveway next to them. And so a question for you could, and when we get to discussion after the bonus section, would be whether going down even farther could be a good idea to help incentivize others beyond slots. You also asked for design standards for mid-blocks. So these are pretty straightforward. They're really aimed at encouraging participation and not increasing the cost of construction. So the idea is that they need to have 8 feet paths. This is revised down from 10 feet last month. They still accommodate bikes and pedestrians and even cars, depending on where driveway standards land. Landscaping is required in the rest of the space. We're not requiring trees. We're just saying landscaping. There may be, we should talk about how to link that to the landscaping code. And then there was some debate in our firm about should these be signed as being pedestrian access, and we landed on allowing signage, but not large signage, just to keep the residential character of the neighborhood. Another thing that could be interesting to hear from you on. Okay, moving into alleys, we also reduced these down from 20 feet to 16 feet in width to encourage participation. There are alleys all over the region performing just fine at 16 feet. A lot of places are moving up to 20, but the 16 feet really is still performing. So we felt like that may be a better way to get participation because we're requiring a dedication back to the city for the alley. We also discussed that they must be in the rear of the lot, but that heritage trees cannot be removed to build an alley. So there's a clause here offering the possibility of just a bit of flexibility in the case of a tree. Okay, we have a new diagram here, and this is illustrating how the types of connections may look initially in Mountlake Terrace. You see the mid-block in orange, and then it could extend up to the adjacent lot when it redevelops over time, but it doesn't have to. And then the half alley dedication is also shown in yellow, and the potential full alley in light yellow could be extended over time. In hindsight, we could have illustrated one that had more. It did get in the PowerPoint. Okay, so for a while we hadn't quite illustrated it well, but you can see that the duplex that's been added to the rear of the lot in this case is kind of taking advantage of that alley access to access its parking. Okay. Improved parking courts is something you asked for design standards are. So I'm just going to talk about this because we actually think this is worth a bonus. But some of the requirements will be also found in that design standards chapter. We're proposing an area bonus, and you'll see that in the standard slide. But to qualify for the bonus, you need to provide entries, 2 units, so a door, a pedestrian door, at a ratio of 1 per garage door. This is really to activate the space and make it feel like a place for pedestrians and not just cars. I've seen lots of examples where there are no human doors and it does not activate the space. We're also requiring some area in front of each door, really for people to personalize it, put a doormat out, put some plants, wind chimes, whatever. Really kind of adds to the personality of the space, as well as a little bit of planting area. The surface has to be curbless and made of a nicer material than just asphalt or concrete. And then lastly, they need windows looking into the space from above and some lighting to make them feel safer and more pleasant. So it's quite a bit to do beyond what many developers will do, but they'll get a bonus. And then this is a comparison of the do's and don'ts for those improved parking courts, and you can see how the standards I just listed can turn what could be a really people-less and blank, rather ugly space into a more aesthetically pleasing, multi-use and safer space. It's really important on the small lots to make space for people and not just give them over to cars. And you can really imagine these being active with kids playing with chalk or riding their tricycles or neighbors chatting. Okay, so this is the last bonus slide. Would you like to comment on bonuses before I move on to standards? Okay.
Good.
Oh, I have some questions. Is a parking court a mid-block connection?
It could be. It
Okay.
could be part of a mid-block connection. And we actually say in the requirements, in the design standards for connectivity, pedestrian connectivity, that a improved parking court can be part of that pedestrian connection.
Okay. And who maintains these?
Sorry?
If it's dedicated to the city, does the city then maintain it?
Mid-block connections are not, they're an easement. So
Okay.
they'll remain on the land for that lot, and they will have to have public access on them. The alleys are dedicated back.
Okay. So would we then have a potential of alleys that are sort of floating, isolated, only connected by easements? Or is that something that we would have a plan around?
Christy, do you have an opinion on that?
I do. So we've done this in a couple of developments where we've done it as an easement with a caveat on the development or the plat that at such time as there is a connection, that then that would be dedicated to the city. So it kind of bridges that gap of that space being maintained by the property owner until such time as we can make those connections and when we can. So I think that's a good way to do it, where the city, we're not going to get pushback by engineering, which I understand because it would be hard for them to access that back piece and maintain it until they had some logical way of maintaining it.
Okay. And this is interesting because it kind of sets up a game where you're incrementally infilling the block over time. So do we have a way? Do we have a way of like preventing dead end stubs that like are permanently blocked? Like if you're starting, like say you have 2 lots and you put a mid-block connection between them to make this kind of nice space between your townhouses, then do the lots behind the townhouses that are facing the other street, assuming it's like a block, do those then have to continue that mid-block connection, or is that something where we don't really have a mechanism to prevent people from like blocking that mid-block connection and then shifting it like one lot over? So yeah, in this example here, like if, that red, were then, the sort of grayed out red up there were actually shifted a block over, and you didn't have the orange in between them, like do you have a way of preventing that, where it's just a bunch of dead-end non-connections?
I could answer, but
Okay, you go ahead too.
we're going to give a double answer here, I think. I think we talked about this a little bit last time, and the idea is not that we are putting a requirement on future property owners. There's no spatial requirement or exact point requirement for either a mid-block or an alley. We're saying we're incentivizing participation in the hopes that over time, there could be enough connections through a block to make a mid-block connection or an alley. So I have hidden the slide, I've shown it a couple times, where there is an existing middle housing block. Over time, some of these connections have gone through, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they really become private. And so we're not proposing at this time that mandatory connections. Want to add anything else?
No, I totally agree with that. I think the more important maybe is trying to get that alley connection, that future alley connection, really. And the other is going to be organic. I think unless we have specifically, like we do Town Center, where we've designated those connection points, we're being prescriptive on another property owner based on a previous property owner's kind of development. And land use wise, I think we would be in a bit of a predicament. And we would also really limit the way that that other property owner could develop their property. Say we've got the orange and dark, and that's how that developed, and we can connect it to that midpoint. But the property owner on the other property wanted to do a cottage development. But we say, oh, no, you've got to put your access point right here. I think that's an overreach on our part that we're kind of making that happen in all these. So the one example that Heidi showed of kind of how it happened in Seattle, where it's a bit organic of this one, of trying to get that. It's not necessarily a straight grid everywhere, but I think it's more realistic when we're talking about our situation, which is infill. So we're going to try to get some of those connections, and in some cases, we're going to get them. And in other cases, we're not going to get them, and that's okay. We're at least improving on connectivity.
Okay.
And then at some point, I think if this is what we want to see, then we really need to do an assessment of where all those connection points are versus kind of how we're doing just with straight zoning, where we really would need to lay that out.
Okay. So it sounds like this is a pilot program. I think it would be good to track where these are occurring and how often they connect and how often they don't. It sounds like we're kind of relying on statistics to sort of make these connections. Another way we might be able to help control the connections is, I know in the existing municipal code, there are some like standards around where, zones step from one to another. You have to have, I don't know, landscape buffers or something like that. I'm not proposing we do that here, but the zoning, if there is a way to sort of incentivize making it maybe along the zoning boundary, like those do tend to be complete straight lines through property lines, through properties. So maybe that's a way of like gaming it where it can be incentivized to create continual connections. Not sure what everyone else thinks about that or how practical it is, but I do see us revisiting this a few times in the future, since this is sort of an emerging thing.
Yeah, I think we require landscaping when we're typically, depending on what you're developing, right? So when we're having that interface between like commercial and just straight residential, in this example, this is basically residential, straight residential, and then trying to find additional connections through those neighborhoods. So, but yeah, I would say this is a good first attempt, and we've been trying to do it with a couple other things along the way, but formalizing it a little bit more on this step, and then we can further take a look at kind of those. I think that's where a lot of us have talked about, we need a full pedestrian trails. We need to have a more comprehensive look at the city as a whole to really do it justice. But this is a good, I think, a good starting point, at least for this middle housing zoning to get going.
Yeah, I know we're in I don't know how many more revisions we have, but I know we're up against the deadline. So
Yeah.
something to revisit in the future. But I think this is one of those things that I'm really excited about the potential of it. I want to see it be successful. And so like, I think we need to pay attention to it and sort of nurture it along.
I think the amount of bonus we give is yet to be determined. And so, when we get there, because we're about to propose FAR, let's discuss it. I think that it's definitely a carrot we have.
Great.
Any thoughts on the dimensions we are requiring? So we've gone to, now I've lost the diagram, but we've gone to 8 feet for the alley dedications and 16 feet for the mid-block connections. Is that too wide for the mid-blocks?
Has the fire department commented?
They have. I just told Heidi, we've been discussing this. It looks like they're willing to go down to a 15-foot access. Before it was a 20-foot access with an additional 4 feet of sidewalk. But we're doing it along fire department, our International Fire Code standards, meaning if you have 150 feet less in length, you don't need a turnaround. And logically, they'll have accessibility from the street, and they won't even use that access drive for firefighting purposes. So our thing is do you really, in certain situations, need this wide of a driveway access, essentially, when you're not going to use it for fire purposes? You're going to park the truck on the street. And if we're truly trying to do alternative housing types and sizes for middle housing, then we're taking up a lot of a lot in order just to pave it. For really what reason? Versus making the drive wide enough to be able to maneuver a vehicle properly in and out of either parking spaces or a garage, and at the same time do some design standards where we're distinguishing a clear pedestrian path that's going to be used more so to basically get in and out of the driveway and walk to your units. So I think we can handle a lot of it with design standards and have an adequate access drive into these.
Yeah, I agree. 15 feet feels right. 16 feet feels right for an alley. That's what I've seen in other alleys.
In cases where there's no car access, is 16 feet still seem needed?
Seems proportionate to the alleys as well. So every time you're looking through mid blocks or alleys, having that consistent width probably adds a lot of visual appeal too. So
Yeah, that actually kind of feeds into the comments that I had as well. When it comes to these mid-block connections, I know there's some mention, some, flexibility, but will there be specific design standards that the city will create for the materials that will be used for the mid-block connections? Just so there's more of a visual cue that, hey, this is something that's intended for the public to use and isn't just private space?
I think we have control out of that because it's not public works. The alleys, we basically put them back to the right-of-way standards for alleys. I know you only have 2 right now, but essentially there will be city standards for that alleys need to comply with. And then on private property, they could be an improved parking court, or they could be concrete, or they could be asphalt. So I am proposing that we don't make them nice enough that no one can afford to do them. So I haven't done that, but it's something to consider.
Okay. Yeah, I'm
So-
thinking that if there's, you're always looking for visual cues when you're out in the public space, and continuity is a good thing. And if you've got half of your mid-block connection is concrete paving stones, and the other half is like more of a concrete sidewalk that's, poured to right-of-way standards, it's kind of disjointed. It doesn't look like it's cohesive and continuous. So I understand that, one is probably cheaper than the other. But I think some basic standards are probably going to be needed just so that there's continuity, especially since there might be such a delay from when one segment of a mid-block connection is built versus you might be waiting 5 or 10 years for the next segment, and then, who knows whatever design trend is, popular then. The other question that I had is you mentioned that they aren't going to be required to put in trees for this. But my question is does this mid-block connection count as their open space?
It does not count as their open
Okay,
space.
so they're still required to have a minimum amount of open space other than the mid-block connection.
Correct. And I'm making a note to add that.
Okay.
We don't explicitly say it yet, but we should.
Gotcha.
But let's remember in middle housing, because this is one of the things that Commerce also commented on our draft, that we need to make sure when these town slots, these other types of middle housing, if we don't require it for a single-family house, we can't require it for these other types of housing. So we got to be really careful on what we're requiring for certain middle housing types. And the state did that purposely to try to keep the price point down for these middle housing units, right? And so just kind of keep that in the back of our mind, that if we do for one, then we've got to do for all, or vice versa. So they commented like where we had over threshold of a certain unit count, we had additional parking. They said, no, can't do it. Same is going to be some of these design standards when we're talking middle housing, of landscaping and some other things, because right now for like single family, we don't have specific, well, we do for townhomes, but under the middle housing provisions, we got to be careful in what we're requiring and not requiring. So it's going to have to be more of a carrot approach than the stick approach to these things.
I think, especially with the examples that you use, you have these pedestrian connections with trees directly adjacent to it. Since the path doesn't count as part of their open space, if there's a way then to encourage the developers, take advantage of the fact that you're having this path here, put your open space next to it, then you're getting in reality, while only half of that space counts as their open space, you've essentially doubled the open space when you're counting the mid-block connection, and it would also allow the trees to grow bigger because they're not as encumbered. Because right now I have this fear is, we're trying to get them to keep trees on their property as well, because there's too much competition for what's in the right of way. We want street trees, but we're not always going to be able to put 5 street trees adjacent to every single parcel.
Right.
So we need to figure out a way where we can game plan this, where the trees on private property will be successful and not just shoved into the corner and not getting any sunlight or any daylight, and they can check a box and said, oh, well, we planted a tree, and you go back in a year and the thing is dead. If you're able to maybe encourage them, hey, combine your required open space with your pedestrian path, you're getting a double bonus and probably more likely that the trees will thrive. And I think it helps because the examples that you use have the trees directly adjacent to the path. And it it definitely enhances the path. Because you're also pushing the buildings further back from the path, so it doesn't feel as constrained and as isolated, and it gets kind of back to that more opening and inviting for the general public to use. Because honestly, if I'm just walking down the street and I see a path between two townhomes of the same development, my first mind isn't, oh, I can walk down there. I'm like, oh, that's private property. I'm not supposed to do that.
Is there support for adding a tree requirement in mid-block connections?
I would support it.
I don't know how practical it is for a 16-foot right-of-way dedication to have a tree canopy coverage. Ideally, what I would like to see is for all of our rights-of-way to have some kind of minimum canopy coverage requirement for urban heat island effect. I think if we were able to achieve that similar goal by trees or by building or by shading mechanisms or something, maybe there's some way around that. Or, you know, there's also other things that trees bring to have a benefit of, like wildlife corridors, and just they're nice to look at. I think in a right-of-way this narrow, I could see wanting to maybe establish some of those goals as part of design standards and then let people sort of mix and match, like in order to achieve the desired effect, which is probably don't have time to do that right now. But I do think that if we're looking at standards, that's something to look at. And then also, like, I think you brought up a really good point, Chair Bautista, about like if you have one, you know, the separation between one and the next. And I think an important part of that is also cars, and are cars present or not. So you make like a nice pedestrian pathway, and all of a sudden, you know, one day they finish the connecting thing, but it's a parking alley, and then you have the cars that are suddenly driving down your pedestrian alley, or maybe there's some way to like mitigate that. But I think that's another element as well. I don't know what you think about that, or if that aligns kind of with what you're thinking, but.
Makes it a little tougher when you're thinking of, you know, the auto part of it versus just the pure pedestrian path part of it, because, you know, obviously you throw cars into the mix, it becomes a little bit more dangerous, and there's more moving parts and bigger concerns. How that would be designed, you know, would probably take a little bit more thought, and probably would require more space to ensure that safety is there, so you're not sharing.
Yeah, I think there are like, you know, there are like design features that are like, you know, for kind of visual continuity, and then there are also design features that are for safety. And I think if we wind up with a situation where you have like a car street and a non-car street are two fundamentally different kind of streets. And so I think we'd want to deal with that first. And then I think design standards will probably wind up being revisiting at some point, but I think a tree canopy coverage, like, I could see wanting to achieve things that trees would achieve, but I could also see within a 16-foot right-of-way or easement, like it would be difficult to have, like as you're saying, trees that actually thrive. Maybe there is some bonus you can give that also aligns with the tree canopy bonus, or I think if you're not allowed to, you know, demolish a heritage tree to build your mid-block connection, is there some way you can like move around the tree and dedicate more land? Like, you know, 8 feet's a minimum, right? So maybe there's some design way around that to still get the density bonus. But like, I think that you bring up a good point of wanting, you know, kind of shading and other things trees bring. But I think there's a lot of ways that could go, and I'd like to explore them, but I don't know if we have the time to do that, to get this done by the end of June. Do we?
I think we have time for some design standards, and overall I'm hearing that you want more design standards in these in mid-block connections. I've just been through a years-long process of doing tree code with middle housing in Tacoma, and it's quite an effort. So I think if it's something you want to do, it could be a post-adoption. It's not required now, but you know, something for the to-do list.
And then before we move on, I just want to double check, since we talked about quite a bit so far, if any of our online commissioners have any comments so far, or maybe questions for staff.
I like, this is Deneen. I like the suggestion that we do, so that we meet the deadline, that we do this as a post adoption, looking at the design standards and things of that nature, so that we can make sure we meet our deadline.
I guess my only concern is the difference between kind of the private versus public areas and how that's defined. I think that becomes difficult, and that might be what we're talking about here. Yeah. Because if we try to make too much, public based, or sorry, private based, we might limit the ability for a developer to pencil out a project versus, what ends up being public, which I encourage, and I think we're all encouraging, but then, where do we draw the line there?
Commissioner Morgan, I think that's where we're talking about giving incentives for the public portion. You don't necessarily have to do it on the mid-block connections, but if we're potentially incentivizing some of those things, then there's an option of folks having a choice on what they want to do other than providing an easement for those future alley accesses. So I think that's one way to do that. I think we could also potentially incentivize some additional landscaping, if you will, as part of our program, because we typically don't require landscaping for home. If you're building a single family home, we don't have any landscaping requirements,
Other than keep your grass mowed?
Yes, well, that's, code compliance, right, but we don't tell you what to plant. We don't tell you how many trees you need. We don't tell you that you have to put sod down versus bark. So that's where I was saying we have to be careful in these other housing types of what we require and how we're probably looking more at incentive-based and not necessarily, and being careful on what we're requiring.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I think, and I think all of these concerns kind of come together here in how do you describe that? And also, what are the requirements? And then can you ride a bike on grass? Is grass or is, something other than a hardscape? Does that meet this design standard or not? I think is kind of a big question, because I could see maintained grass being a very low cost, effective way to allow for these kind of connectivity areas. But then not everyone's going to maintain that, except for maybe, some of the apartment buildings. I don't see townhouses and their HOAs necessarily accommodating that. So I think there's might be a lot kind of to think about here in the details. But I'd love to also hear what other cities have done to encourage this and allow for this in a simplified fashion.
I'd let staff confirm this for sure, but I'm assuming that if the purpose of these mid-block connections are for the public use, then they would have to be ADA compliant. I don't know if just grass would be ADA compliant.
Yeah, it wouldn't be approved for a surface treatment, emergency vehicle-wise or otherwise, right? You have to have something that can hold up to vehicle traffic over time, right? So there's certain standards. So it couldn't be grass. You could do some, potentially in these courts, some type of pervious paver type scenario.
And that's kind of where my head was going, was kind of like these pervious type of areas rather than grass. Yeah, that was probably a bad example, but non-vehicular, nothing that needs to maintain a vehicular type of riding over it, but something that's still lower cost, easy to implement, also easy to maintain. Because I think that's another aspect is the more of these standards we add, the more the HOA costs we add, and then the higher the cost of the housing is. Or even, yeah, I mean, I guess we're going back to the fact this is probably also maintained by the city. I also don't want to increase the city's need to, maintain these areas, but I still want to see these areas happen. It's just kind of coming up with like what meets our ability to maintain versus what also pencils out, for a developer.
Can you just provide clarification? I believe like the alleys would be dedicated to
Yeah,
the
so
city,
that-
but the mid-block connections would be maintained by the private
That's
property.
correct. That's correct. So the property owner would, or HOA would need to maintain the mid-block connections.
That would be HOA. So like, and I guess I hope that we all kind of think about the difference in those areas and how we don't cause a, $500,000 townhouse to also be a $800 a month HOA because they've got to hire, specialized maintenance teams to come out and maintain that area.
Okay, so I'm hearing mixed things. I'm hearing we want them to look really nice, and we also want them to be affordable, which, I mean, everybody wants both of those things. I think so far we've taken the approach that the improved parking court is an aesthetically improved, nice place to be, and we can talk about what the FAR bonuses or area bonuses would be for those. And then the connectivity elements are, because they're giving away a lot of space, and that's valuable, I've taken the approach of it should be fairly bare bones. If they want to make it nice, awesome. But if they just want the concrete driveway and sidewalk portion of the development to serve that purpose, you've got a connection. And so prioritizing the connection over the quality of the design. If you want to keep a quality design, you may want to offer more of an incentive to do that. I don't know, Mackenzie, if that's something we can study or talk about with developers, but I wouldn't want to design this into a point where no one's going to participate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We have a couple developer interviews left. We can definitely ask about that. But my sense, based on the conversations we've had so far, is that this is already kind of an expensive thing to be adding on. And yes, you do get a bonus for it, and that does offset some of the costs. But adding in requirements like landscaping or trees adds significant cost to this kind of space that then also adds ongoing cost to the homeowner or the renters. So that's definitely something we can explore. But my sense is that in order to incentivize it to actually be used, simpler is probably better.
I could see a case where successful mid-block connections that have happened are actually awarded a pool of money from the city that has been collected from some other place to beautify the mid-block connection, for example. But I do agree connectivity is most important.
Yeah, I think like there is some incentive to providing some design standards just for the people who are buying those homes, like you can see in the picture on the left there. Like that is also a space that that's part of their home. And so there's an incentive to make it nicer in order to attract buyers. And so there are some incentives there, but for the public space or that the area where the cars would be, things like that, it would be more difficult to add design standards onto without additional incentives.
Yeah, maybe I'm misunderstanding this. It seems like is the landscaped area, you've got the bike ped path, are we mandating that's 8 feet wide, or are we mandating that's like some percentage of 8 feet wide and the remainder is allotted to like a home?
We're saying that should be 8 feet wide, but in a 16-foot wide space. So basically half of it is paved, half of it is landscaped.
Okay. So it could be that you're dedicating 8 feet, which is half of the 16 feet in the future. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this. 16 feet is entirely on the lot, or is it assuming there's a replicated 16 feet? Like if we go back to that, we've talked about, I think we're talking about two distinct entities here, right? Alleys and mid-block connections. The alleyway is at the short end of the lot, as you're showing here. So assuming the back, and at the corner is the short end of the lot, or the one that's facing the street that does, whatever language we have to describe that. And then that's 8-foot dedication. The mid-block connection is 16 feet of dedication.
It's a 16-foot easement with an 8-foot path. I think what's challenging here is we're showing it at a slot that has a driveway that's probably 12 feet wide. But the whole area needs to be dedicated, have an easement on it. You can imagine people want to walk up and down the path. Maybe there's a little bench or an area to be there. We want the whole area to be the easement. You could, I don't know, think about if it should only be 12 feet or 8 feet or just the path, but.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is that you've got two classes of dedication or easement dedication. One is 8 feet wide, dedicated to the city, that's an alley. The other is 16 feet wide, it's an easement. And if you wanted to tie into that from the adjacent parcel and get the same dedicated bonus, you would have to have another red strip running up the left side of like the second lots from the right in this image. So you'd have a total 32-foot wide mid-block connection.
I would hope that another development, let's see if my pointer works, say here, would not build another one, but could park off of it.
Okay, but then they wouldn't get the density bonus. They would just benefit from it.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're allowing more density bonus for the red than the yellow.
We could talk about that. I have a little note down here that says, let's separate them so they can be treated differently.
Okay,
and I clearly different.
Yeah, I think, and you know, if we're talking about alleyways, could you have an alley that's like parallel to the street on the left? Like, could you have an alley on the long side of the lot?
We're saying no, that's really parallel to the street like most alleys. Well, I guess some alleys are not. It's a good question.
Yeah, I've seen alleys parallel to the arterials before, and that works better for like vehicular intersections and the arterials sort of continuity. But I think setting it up as two different dedications, maybe with two different FARs, might like give you like extra incentive to add some landscaping. But you know, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to. You still can benefit from, you know, providing some kind of mid-block connection that is then replicated on the other side. But that sort of, if you want more, then you can do more, basically. I think that sort of sets up a good incentive structure.
Okay.
Where we prioritize connections, but if you want to do extra, then it's also an option.
One quick thought on the incentivization mechanisms. It seems that like what's good for the goose is good for the gander, in that if you have one, it's, you know, triply good to connect it and get that extension. So to the extent that you've got one, could you bonus the second one that like connects it even more at a slightly even higher ratio than the first one?
I think we proposed that in a little bit.
Is that a no?
This is a preview.
Yeah, there's a thing called proportionality. And that's really where we're treating, there's an equity, right, in all things, right? So we have, it has, in planning, it's called a proportionality test legally. So I can't say, you know what, Chair Batista, I'll give you $10 because you did that. But Commissioner Wu, I'm going to give you $30. So we have to always keep things equal as far as standards that we're equitably applying things. So I would say, no, let's not do that. We haven't been taken to court in a land use case, and I would hate to do that. I just think we might need to put a little bit of thought, or maybe we incentivize the requirement for the alley over the mid-block connection. You know, and we also have to remember, even if we have landscaping, if we're using that connection for parking and vehicles, then we still have to have a certain width. You got to be able to maneuver a vehicle in and out of a garage and do other things unimpeded, right? So we always have to keep that in mind. Landscaping looks beautiful, and I look at those pictures and I'm like, the landscaping makes it beautiful. But at the end of the day, the primary purpose is getting in and out of that development.
I also think there's a risk with the 8-foot right of way that you're going to wind up having weird alleyways that just like half of it goes away every so often as well. Like none of these are going to like perfectly create over time. So is an 8-foot alleyway even functional, I think, is another question.
No.
What about
So
a 10-foot?
I kind of want to build upon Commissioner Betcher's comments. And I think this is like good for context of everything, but, and I don't know if we can do any sort of like data discovery on this, but at what point in the next 20 years do we think we're going to encounter this also is, I think, another question. I know we are all looking into the future, and is this kind of like, are these things that we do need to focus on and put our time into today to make sure that we account for them in the next 20 years? Or are these 20 plus year type of developments that maybe we can push some of this, like some of these details off for?
When's it going to develop, Mackenzie?
Good question. I think you are definitely not going to see every developer interested in doing this kind of thing. A lot of developers, especially smaller ones, will be more interested in just taking, you know, the base standards, not going after any kind of bonus, just simplistically not needing to, you know, think about the extra design standards and how do we fit it on the lot and all of that. So I think some developers would be interested in potentially receiving this bonus. There are also other things, as we've talked about and we'll talk about, that they can get bonuses for, which may or may not be easier to provide based on, you know, the type of development and the type of lot that it is. So I think it's probably not a tomorrow thing, but also
More of a feasibility thing, I think, like today, and then maybe in the future, it becomes like a normal part of what we should think about. And I guess I'm just trying to help us make sure we don't necessarily try to put too many standards in that aren't relevant to the next 20 years versus maybe 40 years out. Because I love what we're thinking about and what we're talking about, but when I put it into context of having lived in the city and now having moved outside the city, I feel like we're talking about city of Seattle things, probably even for the next 15 years of Mountlake Terrace's history. And so should we put these kind of requirements in for our developers who are building over the next 15 years?
I do think that these are also the type of thing that the more there are, the more attractive they are to complete. No one probably wants to be the first one building an alley to nowhere. And so,
I agree.
I mean, there is the bonus, but also there is more incentive the more of them there are. And so keeping it on the simpler side, maybe to keep costs down for the first few years, and then seeing how those go, tracking how many people are engaging in this program, how many people have taken advantage of this bonus, and then also looking at the types of alleys and mid-block connections that have been developed and reflecting on if that's the type of development that you want to see or if there are things that aren't working. And you don't have to wait for like 10 of them or anything like that, but as you go, I think you can be reflecting on it.
I would say these type of
I would say
properties.
keep going. I like where you're going. You're reading obviously kind of what I'm saying, and I love to hear this. Like more I guess math-based decisions on these kinds of things rather than like putting in strict requirements over the next few years, just because I love what we're talking about. And I think we all want to see the city be like this in these photos. I want to see this everywhere downtown, but we're not there today. And are we going to be there in 20 years? And so should we think about that, or should we think about where we're going to be at in the next 10 to 15 years?
Commissioner Morgan, I would say these are this is an incentive. This is what we're proposing it as an incentive. But as far as this type of development, we've done more townhome development than any other development in the city in the last several years besides mixed-use residential. We've done very few single-family residential builds in the city. The majority of what we're seeing is these townhome type developments and other newer developments. So I don't think it's 15 or 20 years down the road. I think it's now. And if you don't start to acquire these things as you go, then you've lost that potential for this to redevelop for the next 50 or 60 years. So even if it's a very simplified approach, I think it's an approach worth starting out in trying to at least keep it simplified, but nonetheless taking the opportunity where it presents itself.
I'd like to make a comment as well.
I completely agree. I like the way you put that, Christy. I'm right with you on that. That makes a lot of sense.
I'd also like to make a comment as well and just kind of look at this from the other angle. Like when I look at these pictures, like the townhouses already kind of look like this, but just one half of it, right? Like the developers are already building them this like this, where you've got, you know, like a strip of like, you know, sidewalk on one side and the doors enter from there. And then you've got like an alley in the middle where the cars drive through. And then the other side, you've got kind of the same thing. So they're already building them this way. But I think what this does is it gives them a mechanism where you can start to link them. So I don't think we're really inventing anything new here. I think this is just like taking what is already done and then codifying it in a way that like allows people to like get some credit for the work they're doing by allowing other people to tie into that infrastructure they've already built. I don't know if like maybe some kind of background statement to that effect might help, but I feel like this is kind of like building on what we're already seeing people do, and then this is just allowing people to like link into that.
So maybe we add a purpose statement in our regulations of what the intent is to clarify.
I like purpose statements.
Yeah, okay. What we're thinking.
I will note that adding in purpose statements and the intent into the code was also feedback we got from the real estate professionals that we talked to.
Okay, who would like to
I will add
move
to that.
on?
I like that.
Ready for residential standards where you get into how much you will incentivize these things we've just discussed? Okay, that's why we had to do it in
Yes.
this order. Okay, thank you for the feedback. That's really helpful. Okay. Most of our time together has been going over the residential standards, and we heard quite a bit from you and the council on a couple topics, and so we're just going to go over those 3 topics. Those include the scale, what I call scale standards, FAR versus lot coverage, open space, and a little bit on setbacks. as Christy mentioned, we also got the review comments back from Commerce, and overall, they're all very doable comments, no fatal flaws that we found, some questions for them. But overall, they include making sure middle housing is explicitly allowed in all the zones where residential is allowed, clarifying a lot of definitions, clarifying the administrative design review process. And those are the comments related to residential standards. Okay, got the map here like usual if we want to go back to it. Okay. So let's start this scale discussion with height. I first want to mention we've revised where you measure the front and rear heights. We had 80 foot, the first 80 feet was the front height, where the front height applied, and then 20%. We've changed it to 75 and 25. It just feels more doable. It seems to align with the standard better. So that's a little detail. So then we've also added exceptions to the maximum heights. This is coming from your existing transitional zone. We just missed getting that in there. It includes roof access, parapets, fall protection, railings, that kind of thing. And then we've gone ahead and added that extra PV height, as you mentioned last time. Okay, so as you remember, we have the front height, the back height. They step up from R1 to R4 a little bit differently in the front and the back, but overall, they step up by right and they step up for affordability or connections. Okay. You've seen this slide a couple times. It's basically showing those test fits with both lot coverage and FAR numbers. And as you remember, we had to lower the lot coverage percentages for R1 and R2 to help scale up from the lowest to highest intensity zones. And so this is that previous table. In the city council meeting, they were concerned about reducing the lot coverage from existing, which would limit single-story additions to existing houses. That was very much a concern for them. And so while we had shown a small house with 22% lot coverage in the test fits and went up to 30%, some houses, typical houses, already have 30% lot coverage. So like the leftmost house in this example, building a small addition and adding a dado to any of the houses, they'd put them all above the lot coverage maximum that we had proposed.
I will just say, I think that's a good call out on their part that I don't think discussed and we might have overlooked.
Yeah, I thought so too. Okay, so even with, we had an exception for dados and ADUs, the lot coverage could still be challenging. And basically force vertical additions. Okay. So we'll propose using FAR to control scale, and this is just a table from the model code guidebook. I don't think that's the right name. I'm blanking on the right name, which compares the lot cover, compares lot use or lot coverage versus FAR. Basically says what we've discussed in previous meetings, that lot coverage is pretty easy to understand. I think that's something you really liked about it, something you've used, and it ensures some open space on the lot. And the table also says FAR is better at controlling building massing because the area becomes proportional to the lot size. And these are some accompanying graphics from that model code. All of these have an FAR of 1, but very different lot coverage. Okay, so this is the proposal, and I landed here and paused for a moment, but let's go over the proposal. So based on the conversations with you in council, we are proposing to use both lot coverage and FAR. So in that top band, we've set the max lot coverages above their previous maximums in R1 and R2. So we're proposing 45 and 50%. Both of them had been 40%. So there's still quite a bit of room to add single-story additions. And then we've kept the lot coverages at 60% for R3 and R4. We've batted around going to 65% in R4. It'd be interesting to hear your opinion on that. We're also proposing to add FAR with more FAR offered for more density. So the model code uses this as well. So you get 0.5 FAR for a single-family house, goes to 0.6 for 2 units, 0.8 for 3 units, and on up to 1.4 by right in the R3 and 4. Then for bonusing, we'd go to 1.8 in R3 and 2.4 in R4. And then we'd increase the FAR by small increments when providing certain public benefits that we've been talking about. So for stacks, we really don't think they're going to be feasible, right, Mackenzie? So we're giving a really large FAR bonus for that, 0.5 for doing stacks. We've considered 0.1 for tree retention, and then 0.2 for connections. So that would be alleys or mid-blocks. And this is where Christy's going to say we don't have, what's the vocabulary word I used? I learned tonight. Proportionality. So I think you're going to say that we can't have 0.2 for doing a half block connection and 0.4 for the full block.
As long, we may be able to, as long as we're consistent with what we're allowing throughout, we could do that. It's just when we still have zoning. It's just there's some things we need to be careful. I think, let me noodle on that, but I think we're going to be okay on that to distinguish between those two.
Okay.
That seems like that's a reasonable, if you do this, if you do that, this.
Yeah, I agree. In the example that I had given, it was 2 different lot owners being treated differently for the same thing,
Right,
which was the
exactly.
difference of what
Yeah,
you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't want to necessarily say push back a little bit on the comment that was just made previously on the lot coverage and, council's concerns. We did talk about, the total percentage of the lot coverage. We did have that discussion. And you even mentioned, the goal is to try and maintain as, open space by maybe allowing them to go up as opposed to taking up actual open space away. We also had the discussion about, what is the purpose of these ADUs? Originally, these concepts, were smaller units, not necessarily something that's going to be so big that it's essentially another house in somebody's backyard, for like a family of 5. That's not what the purpose of ADUs are. So I just kind of wanted to push back on that a little bit because we did have those discussions, and I understand, council may have some concerns about that. I know for me, I was comfortable with the previous numbers. If council wants to change those numbers, they can. I know for me that I would recommend what we had already put in previously.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's a discussion of kind of how the majority of planning commission feels on which way to go. I think the concern is that we got some kind of odd numbers when we tried to do just straight lot coverage. And in some cases, we allowed less when we're providing more opportunity on each lot, or that's the intent. I would say originally for accessory dwelling units, the thought was they were a certain fraction of a size of a single-family home. I would say with the recent legislation, that's not the case. That paradigm has shifted into something else than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. We're talking, we have to allow at least 1,000 square foot ADU, which is very different than what the city's allowed up to this point.
I have 9 more slides on FAR. You want me to get through those?
Yeah. Should we go?
Yeah, we should go, but at some point, either now or in the future, especially if the legislation changes, that needs to be revisited. That 1,000 square foot minimum is a little large for my taste.
I just want to say what I had heard in that is it had more to do with single story existing buildings.
Correct.
Are we talking
Yeah.
or talk about the same thing? So in my mind, what I imagined was people who currently live here and may have lived here for 30, 40 years, who may want to make an addition. should not be constrained by what we are trying to I don't want to say control, but decisions we're trying to make about designs of new buildings. And I believe those are very different things, and it would be very frustrating to have to encounter what we're trying to do for new buildings versus me as an existing building owner who's been here for a while that meets that same metric.
Yeah, I will say that there were some concerns from community members about that when we had the community workshop, who were homeowners who were interested in building ADUs and were concerned that with the current lot coverage of their home, that they would not be able to do so to the extent that HB 1337 was intended to allow. And that was also something that had come up in the developer interviews that we did, as well as with real estate brokers who had clients who were interested in building ADUs on their homes or purchasing homes that could have an ADU added to it so that that could be an additional source of income or a place where like a family member could live or something like that.
I imagine we'll get that, but I think I have one other digression I want to ask. Can we go back to that table where you've got the FAR and all the other things that we were looking at? So first I'd like to point out that with a lot coverage of 40% and a 3-story maximum, we already have an FAR of 1.2. So this still represents a significant building down zone for a lot of the city until you get to R3 1.2. As we're talking about numbers, and I'm going to say we're flying through this. I think we're going to get some of the numbers wrong. So I would expect to revisit it because if we, have to look at this over a month, before we have to approve it, I think we just can't reasonably be expected to get the numbers right. So I would expect that we will probably be looking at this at some point in the future. I do have a question just kind of conceptually though. Why are we regulating maximum lot coverage and FAR at the same time? Is it a bit duplicative?
Lots of places do this, and they tend to give more lot coverage than you would need to use FAR. Mm-hmm. They have kind of some slack between them. And so that's why we've bumped up R1 and R2 a bit.
Okay. What is the concern for maximum lot coverage? What kind of things does it address? Why are we regulating it?
It's basically it's setting up the amount of open space or open area you have on the site.
Okay, and that's for environmental area regulations as well.
But you don't regulate impervious surface.
Right, and I think that I, would almost say that impervious surface is probably more important for the things we're looking at.
Well, we do stormwater-wise.
Yeah.
So I would say there's two things for zoning and building we don't, for stormwater calculations we do. Mm-hmm. So different things control different mechanisms.
Right. Okay, so I think in my mind, that is also part of this equation here, part of the reason why we're even regulating area on the lot to begin with. It's partly the scale of buildings, which I think you're regulating by FAR, but it's also partly environmental concerns, things like areas for trees and impervious surface and things like that. So I'm wondering if if we're trying to regulate scale through FAR, if maybe that number is better described in some other kind of regulation we may already have. So just kind of conceptual question.
Can you clarify, do you mean if FAR is better described in some other way or lot coverage?
Sorry, FAR is about the scale of the buildings, but then lot coverage is about the extent of the buildings for things like stormwater retention and tree coverage and things like that.
So would you be in favor of removing lot coverage as a standard?
I would be interested to hear what the development community says. I know sometimes including both can be a bit confusing is feedback I've heard. So I think that, we don't want to carpet the entire city with buildings if we can avoid it. I'd rather people build up rather than out personally. And we're already kind of setting the envelope of possibility, which, again, for some of these zones is actually reduced from what we currently allow. But, I'd be interested to hear feedback on including both versus looking at one, like what are some of the side effects we might have?
Okay.
That's all I had to say.
How about I go through some of the visualizations and let's see where we land, and we should come back to the numbers. Just the brief interlude into the ADUs. We do have exceptions for them. I don't think we should get rid of them. You can't cover every scenario possible with the standards themselves. And so regardless of the existing lot coverage or FAR that exists on a house site right now, consistent with state law, any lot can still have those 2 ADUs added in addition to a primary house, and we're giving an extra 1,000 square feet for one and 1,600 for two. And so that could be in a single story, it could be in 2 stories or 3 or whatever. And so in any case with the FAR and lot coverage proposals, they get that. Okay. So I'll walk you through some images that help visualize lot coverage and FAR. Starting with the examples we used last time, we're estimating those FARs from 1.4 to 1.8. And you see their lot coverage is ranging from 45 up to 60%. This is because they're all 3 stories. We're using some pretty loose math as we look at these, but assuming they're all 3 stories. Okay, so I'll click through 6 illustrations showing slots on a prototypical 7,200 square foot Mountlake Terrace lot. They each max out their FAR for the densities that they're showing. They start at an FAR of 0.6 as shown here, and then we go up to 1.8 on the 6th slide. Each of those units has a dedicated garage, 1-car garage. Okay, so this example has 2 units, which gets them an FAR of 0.6. There's a lot coverage of 20%, and then the units average almost 2,200 square feet. This example has 3 units, which gets them an FAR of 0.8 and a lot coverage is 27%. If they're in this example, the units average about 1,900 square feet. Then we go to 4 units, an FAR of 1 and a lot coverage of 33%. Units are 2,200 square feet. 5 units, 1.2 FAR, 40% lot coverage, a little over 1,700 per unit. This one's the last slot, and it represents the maximum FAR allowed by right in R3 and R4. It has 6 units, an FAR of 1.4, and a lot coverage of 47%, and the units are under 1,700 square feet on average. And I got a little note on here that says the habitable space doesn't comply, but we tried to make these really illustrative comparative diagrams, and so the designer would have to do something about making those units or making that front unit comply with active space in the front. Okay, this last one is the bonus condition in R3, where additional FAR and a full story has been earned by providing affordable units. So keeping the same footprint, just to compare to the 6-unit one, this is a 4-story multiplex. It has 10 units, 5 parking stalls, an FAR of 1.8, and a lot coverage is identical to the 6-unit one at 47%. Okay, that's just to help visualize what these could be. And this is the last FAR related slide, and it's a flip of the tables we showed last time. It shows the maxed out FAR for each density in each zone, and then lists the lot coverage, unit count, and average unit sizes for each of those. This is kind of theoretical work. And I apologize, we've got the FAR for the single family listed, or we've got 2 listed twice. That should change to a unit count of 1 goes down to a 0.5. which limits the units. Well, so see the top line, the top white line in each of these, it should say 0.5 for the single family house. And that gets them 3,600 square feet on that 7,200 square foot lot. And that's the same on 3 of those lines. So if I point to them, that should be a 0.5.
Let me pull my glasses so I can see what you're pointing at.
Yep, see that? In R1 where it says 0.6 at the top, that it's 3,600 square feet. And then the same on the first line here, under R2 and under R3 and 4. And that's an important one because we're limiting single family to 3,600 square feet on a 7,200 square foot lot. We had proposed 0.6 and then we thought, well, why would we do that? Why don't we incentivize duplexes more? And so you should weigh in on that.
I mean, I agree. We have a lot of SFR in Mountlake Terrace, I think. So, yeah, I'm in agreement.
You like it? You like the proposal? Okay.
I mean, at the 0.5 instead of the 0.6.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious how these numbers align with what Commerce's guidelines are for FAR. I know they had some, like for different typologies, they published different FAR requirements. I feel like they kind of, I don't know, my memory is they were kind of like, 0.7 to 0.9 or something like that. Are we below what Commerce is requiring?
They're slightly lower. And what really matters is lot size and what the effect of large lots has on, if you have the same FAR Commerce had and they're using a 5,000 square foot lot or a 4,000 square foot lot, they have smaller houses because the lots are smaller. When you have larger Mountlake Terrace lots, those houses get bigger. And so we've brought them down a bit and then provided the illustration so you can see what you're getting, right, on those larger lots.
I just pulled up the model code, and they range from 0.6 for 1 unit to 1.6 for 6 units, which is fairly close to what we have here.
Okay. I remember looking at this and thinking, oh, well, Mountlake Terrace has an FAR of 1.2. We're like, good. So it sounds like we're still within the limits of what we want. Personally, I think, I don't know, the numbers do still kind of represent a significant area down zone for a lot of the city, which I kind of have some concerns about. So I think I would kind of like to revise them a bit upwards. It's interesting philosophically, I guess, that we've sort of banned McMansions from this code. Like, you can't build a 5,000 square foot house on your lot. And I think if you had a 7,200 square foot house before, it was like, well, you could probably build 10,000 square feet or something like that. I don't know. I kind of like the idea that there's a mix of possibilities where you might have like the very large house next to some of the very small houses. I think that's kind of healthy from a social dynamic where you have people of different income levels living within a city. And so I'm a bit hesitant to say, no, you can't build any very large houses here. But I'm not sure what everyone else thinks.
I would absolutely agree. I think if somebody has a lot and they just want to build a single house and they want to build a big house, I think they should be allowed. Obviously not in our, 5 feet from our transit, our mass transit. But I think that that should be something that we shouldn't prohibit. We should allow.
Yeah, but I also think we shouldn't incentivize it either, right? Like when we had the economic study, the two things that were really easy to build were giant houses and townhouses. And I think if we do allow big houses, we should be either providing an anti-incentive, or we should be incentivizing the duplexes and everything else a bit more.
That's what I was going to add is that, yeah, in the feasibility study, even more so than townhomes, are very large single-family homes, which is a lot of the development that you've been seeing, along with townhomes as well. But they do, the current proposal allows up to a 3,600 square foot single-family home, which is still a very large single-family home in a lot of markets, including this one, I think. But yeah, just to echo your point around what kind of the baseline is for if it's allowed, this is the thing that will get built most of the time. And currently that's large single-family homes.
Yeah, and I think if we had an overly restrictive building envelope already, like, I think it would be less of like, I would have a little bit less pause. But I think, well, I don't know, I feel like this is a longer discussion than we have time for like approving the numbers by June. So like, I'm inclined to like, whatever the numbers are, like, we should probably get them in the code and accept them as provisional, but then like revisit them in the future. But I think there's an interesting, like, if you want to build a giant house in the city, you have to be prepared to pay like for that privilege in some way. But like, we still welcome you. But then like, that way you're not taxing the smaller houses more. I guess, I don't know how you incentivize that or make a structure around that. But I think that outright banning large houses is probably like not necessarily the way that I would prefer to see that.
I think there's a lot of lots there that are also 9,000 square feet, so you take 0.5 on that, it's still 4,500. And also that any existing structure on the SFR lot, you also automatically get plus 1,000 on that too. So to the extent that maybe it's not one huge house, but it's also, even if it's for your own consumption, your semi McMansion plus your ADU, you can still kind of get there. But we're working under the assumption of a 7,200 square foot lot, which is probably a good assumption. But there's plenty of 9,000 square foot lots too that I encounter.
Sorry to cut you off. I was curious, so I just quickly pulled up. The largest home sold in Mountlake Terrace in the last 2 years was 3,609 square feet.
That might have been our neighborhood.
Yeah,
It's
very large.
The upper room on 214.
We may need to look at nomenclature when we're starting to talk about big houses, whatever the accessory dwelling unit, maybe it needs to be called pool house or cabana or or carriage house or something fancy,
Mother-in-law suite, But like,
servants' quarters.
Yeah. So I mean, people probably will wind up like finding ways around that if they really want to build a big house, which is why I think it comes back to like, the numbers are very important, what the numbers actually are, but I don't think we properly have time to address them within this exercise. So I think we should be prepared to like get some more feedback from developers, and it would be great if we could see some pro formas, but like, I think the framework of this is good, but I think that the numbers merit a lot more, the actual numbers and what they are, and even heights, right? Like, 2.5, 3 stories, like, it still represents a down zone for some of the city. And so I think like revisiting these in the future is important, but I think you've set up a good framework for how we should be regulating these things. But then
Where are you thinking it's a down zone?
Since we allow 3 stories everywhere, R1 is like, I don't know how likely it is that anyone would actually do this, but like, so in, R1 and R2, we allow FAR of 1.2 and a maximum 3-story height everywhere. One concern I did have with R2 is that it was intended to be a higher density zone, but I think last time we saw this table, it was maxing out at 2.5 stories. So I think you fixed it by making it 3 stories proper with an incentive, I think. The R1 is a slightly smaller scale, so I think, maybe that makes sense, but it still represents a down zone of like building volume. So instead of building like one building and divide it into like, 2 smaller buildings, you're limiting the scale on a lot, like you don't have 10,000 square feet of area to work with. You now have 7,000 square feet, which is probably appropriate for like 2 houses and an ADU, or a duplex and an ADU. But I think it's something we should be aware of. Like, just kind of a general statement.
I think if you accept FAR as a standard, the pairing of lot coverage as the horizontal control and height as the vertical control doesn't have to be matched as much. You could loosen the height standards if you're concerned about that. I think early on, we did talk about wanting to step down a little bit and worried about buildings looming over backyards. And so we have the rear heights and the front heights. You could just, think about raising the front heights more and keeping the back heights down or something like that. But I think it's less important now if you accept FAR as a control.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think not to oversimplify it, but if we had this, we're kind of keeping a similar envelope for a lot of these conditions with the side and the front and the rear yard setbacks, and then the height, and then the FAR controlling the overall scale of the building, I think kind of makes a lot of sense. Which I think we have a 4-story limit on R3 and R4. Am I reading that right?
By right, 3 stories in R3 and R4. They both can bonus to 4.
Oh, I should turn around and look at this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, the exception for the stacks housing type. That's okay. Yeah, the incentive makes sense. Sorry, I'm confused. I think that's what we would actually wind up getting. I don't think you're going to get a lot of 4-story townhouses, and if you do, they should probably be apartments anyways. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that's the thinking. Okay, great. Okay, there are a couple more slides. Do we want more opinions on FAR, or do we think let's do it and see what happens and revisit, which we've heard? Any more thoughts?
Any opinion from our online commissioners?
I like that someone mentioned having this in as putting some of these numbers in as provisional, and we can come back and look at them later. I like that, but because we have to meet this deadline. But other than that, I don't have an opinion.
The only opinion I really have is I still would be interested in allowing 3 stories in an R1 and an R2 if it means preserving more open space. It's kind of a trade-off.
So going to 30 feet in 3 stories.
Yeah.
Same for R3 and 4, but you can. So what's your bonus? What's your bonus for stacks and the other things you want to incentivize? The 35 feet, 5 more feet?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of, especially, when we're talking about, I'm thinking maybe more, in terms of the single family home,
Sure.
It's we don't want to prohibit somebody doing a single family home, and maybe they say, hey, I want to do a single family home, and, I do want to have X amount of square footage, but we also want to preserve as much open space as possible and say, okay, we'll give you that square footage that you want. We'll let you go, but you got to keep the open space, so we'll let you go up a little bit higher. Who knows, everybody's going to be different, whatever, does the market demand it? Is it, I just, I hate to eliminate that opportunity.
Yeah.
If somebody is out there who is willing to make that compromise, because my biggest concern with all of this and, kind of infill development is the loss of open space. So any opportunity that we can put in there to try and preserve as much open space, or maybe even create open space where it doesn't exist right now. Like, say, let's be honest, a lot of our housing stock is really old, and what's there is a lot of times probably going to be torn down. It's going to be redeveloped. So if it is redeveloped as a single family home, odds are it's going to have more square footage than what's currently there. But as a trade-off, maybe we can allow them to go up higher if we can maybe get them to preserve some more open space. Granted, every lot size is a little bit different. I'm talking in generalities here.
So do you want to bump up R1 as a body to 3 stories, 30 feet? Or 2.5? I mean, 30 feet's what we have right now.
Maybe, again, it's a big, it's a big leap right now, because I mean, there are some streets where right now all of our single-family homes are 2 stories, and there are some streets where there are no 2 stories. So it just depends on, when it was developed, what decade it was, that you really pretty much dictated what the building type was. I don't know, I'm just, I'm sort of just throwing it out there. I know there's probably going to be a lot of varying opinions on that. Maybe like for just an example, how like in R2, it's 2.5 at first, and then, then affordability bonuses, it ends up being 3. Maybe that gets extended to the R1 as well, start at 2.5 and then allowing 3. Because even at, I mean, when we're talking 2.5, we're, that 0.5, I mean, essentially is a 3rd story, but it's more integrated into like the roof design, and it's not outright, which is fine, because honestly, I think that's a nice design feature anyway. I don't like big, boxy looking things, so, but I know height can be a big hot button issue for some people, so.
And I think volume is important for the livability of a house. It makes a huge difference. So getting that extra half story on the 2nd floor, or combining it between the 1st and 2nd, it really does make a big difference.
Yeah.
Would you suggest reducing the lot coverage then from 30 if you're saying preserve the space? Because if you go down to, let's say 25%, right? And we're at 7,200 times 25%, we're at 1,800 on the footprint. Then if you have a garage, that's, and then you build 3 stories up, that's starting looking pretty cubey, like rectangle.
Yeah, no, I don't think I would recommend reducing the lot coverage, especially when it talks about, we had previous discussions, like how much of the frontage do we want as the garage versus, the livable space. And I think if we start reducing the lot coverage too much on that, then you're literally going to get to that point. It's like, well, you told me I can't have half this thing be my garage, but that's all I'm allowed with this coverage. So I mean, I don't have a problem with not reducing the lot coverage. I just think giving them that extra height as an option that would help preserve that open space.
I like the 2.5 starting suggestion. I like it.
Yeah, so nice of the garage to let you live above it. I think, looking at these numbers a little bit more closely, I think one of the questions I have is sort of what is the difference between R1 and R2? Like, I think that would help inform, like, why are the zones different? And between R2 and R3, I think there's a pretty clear distinction in terms of, like, we kind of expect these to be a bit more of like an urban typology. And then R1 and R2 are kind of a bit more suburban typology, or the buildings are assumed to be a bit more separated. Maybe you don't have as well. I think all of these, like, they have side yard setbacks and front yard setbacks, right? So, like, they're all kind of like this separated suburban typology. You're not building like street walls or anything like that. I guess, kind of, did we give these names like 2-family, they're 2-family, 4-family, infinity family, but slightly different scales.
Well, if I remember when we were dealing with this during our comp plan update, the big difference between the R1 and the R2 was really the distance from a transit stop. I know when we were talking about 44th, that was kind of like the delineation is like how far off of 44th are you, and to maybe a lesser extent, as the crow flies from the actual bus stop. And so that's why you saw off of 44th, maybe 1, 2, 3 lots deep, you might have been that R2, but then beyond that, you're still the R1, partly because with our lack of connectivity, the walking distance to try and get to that transit stop is a lot more than what you would think at first. So the idea is allow a little bit more density the closer you were to that transit stop, but recognizing the further away you get from the transit stop or that that arterial, the less likely you're going to see dense multi-unit developments happen.
Right.
You're probably going to be looking at the single-family home option.
Yeah, and so that's like a quantitative way of looking at it. And, this is very much a quantitative table. But then I wonder if we ever establish any qualitative like reasons why these are different. Like, you know, R1 is like the smaller scale where you have more vegetation mixed in. In R2, you sort of transition into urban, so you have a mix of them. And in R3 and R4, the assumption is, you know, you're much more feeling like you're kind of surrounded by buildings in a city, but you still have these little, you know, in a way where it's like, you know, public and private. But I think that
we do have that in our land use descriptions, and we based it on proximity to light rail, and then the higher zoning, if you remember, we based it on proximity along major transportation corridors, right? So also trying to get that kind of neighborhood center thing going along where we're mixing uses a little bit more along those transportation corridors where we're allowing more than just residential use. Now we're putting in commercial use as part of that too, in addition. So I think we have that. It's just determining the scale of, I think maybe there could be just a little bit more distinction between R1 and R2. Because we want to up that to where R2 is a little bit more than R1.
Yeah, from like a numerical standpoint. But then the feel when you're walking through the neighborhood is the buildings are a bit bigger, they hold more people, that kind of thing.
There'll be a big FAR difference because it's tied to density. So if R1 only allows 2 units and R2 allows 4 units, that's double the amount of units. It's going to feel very different. The building types may be different. You'll see fewer duplexes, more slots.
And in our
rows.
previous discussions too, especially in the comp plan update, the hope is that especially in those R2, it would be more pedestrian oriented. We could put more units in there because they wouldn't be as auto dependent. And then the impacts of having doubling or tripling the amount of vehicles that are going to be parked either on the property or trying to fight for streets parking and vehicle trips, you know, hopefully that would be reduced because of that pedestrian sort of incentivized design.
Okay, so yeah, fewer cars, more pedestrians, that kind of thing. So that's the feel you get. And then the scale of the buildings that we're trying to regulate here is why we have the difference between R1 and R2. I like the half-story concept. I think that's a really interesting, like in some places in Europe, they'll regulate up to the top of the vertical wall, and then you like slope back, and then you can get some extra space within the attic, which I think is what this kind of starts to do here.
Yeah.
I think allowing the house to use the attic or the duplex to use the attic may be something we look at by right. So maybe just like shift up the one. So it's like 2.5 stories, and then with the incentivization, you can use the full story. And for R1, like they would only be stacks, right? Like, you know, well, I guess you could probably build like a fourplex, but like, you know, you're already kind of limited to two units without affordability. But I think this sort of controlling the volume by controlling what you can store within a sloped roof to kind of address the scale is a pretty interesting concept as well. Like in other places, they'll maybe give you a bonus for the sloped roof or something on the height. And if we're looking at that, maybe that's something that we'd look at as a way of controlling scale of building while still allowing a bit more space and less footprint on the lot.
Okay, so I'm following everything, but I wonder, are we saying change the heights, or we actually like them because they are scaling per the kind of the comp plan zones you came up with?
No, at least I'm for upping it, you know, to at least start at 2.5.
Okay, so add a 2.5 for R1, keep R2 at 2.5? Okay.
Maybe R2 could be 2, 3, and then 3.5. I don't know. Maybe that's how you make it different.
Just so to make it easy, just shift everything by 0.5.
Yeah,
If it's a 2, it's now a 2.5, it's a 2.5, now it's a 3.
yeah,
et
that
cetera,
kind
et
of
cetera,
thing.
et cetera.
But 3 would just stay 3? Or you'd actually go up in the R3 and 4,
I don't know how often we'd see that because you start getting into the building code.
right?
I see where this came from then, because you're trying to work backwards from the incentivization.
I think if you want to add the ability to do attics, just change the R1 to 2.5, keep the 2 stories in the back. They're still very different than R3 and R4. And where you're really going to see the difference is the number of units that can be added per lot is going to dramatically change how you experience those lots.
Okay. I think that sounds reasonable.
If we change the floor to 2.5 on R1, I think R2 may need an adjustment too, because the lot coverages are 24%. So it seems like it would be, if
Wait,
R2's,
I'm not sure I followed that, sorry.
well, lot coverage on R2 says 24% for 1 unit and 2 units. And then if
The
we're,
proposed,
or am I not
those were old, so now they would be 45 and 50%, or we would get rid of lot coverage as a standard. Still undecided. So slide, I don't know what number it is.
I was on 32.
It's the newly proposed lot coverage and FAR standards. There's the old table in there that has floor plans in it.
So when I'm looking at this, I was thinking of it just being, the sort of the primary structure, or like in this case, the single-family home and not the ADU, or more appropriately in this, the detached accessory dwelling unit. So would this chart say, would this also cover like all structures on the property? So now, like, when because you were kind of mentioning, in the front versus in the back. So, the concern is how anything that's put in like the backyard, kind of impacts what the traditional backyards are, used for, sort of the, how it imposes, especially on the neighbors. Would that mean now it's like, okay, so now we're saying, hey, you can do 2.5 stories for the main structure, the backyard also can go to 2.5 stories, or is this going to be split where we can still say, hey, that backyard structure, we don't want that to be 2.5 stories high. In the max, we want to be like 1 or 1.5.
Well, I think there's room for opinion here, but we had gone down a half story in the rear yard when we last discussed with you. So I think it may make sense to keep 2 stories in the rear yard for R1 and R2.
Was even 2 where we, because I think at least I know I'd mentioned maybe even going down to like 1.5 for the rear.
I think once you can't build a townhouse in the rear yard, you're just really limiting how much middle housing you're going to get.
Yeah, see, for me, I'm not thinking a townhouse in the rear yard. I'm thinking more of an accessory dwelling unit where it's an accessory unit, not a primary unit.
So if we look here, we're limiting that last 1 or 2 townhouses to 1 story. And then you can't build 6 townhouses anymore.
Yeah, I guess where my mind was going with this is I wasn't necessarily thinking about the townhome portion of this. It was more of a, hey, there's a single family home and then there's an accessory dwelling unit, as opposed to it's all going to be like 5 or 6 townhomes. So
I think you also want to consider if we want cottage housing and you regulate it that tightly, you're never going to get any cottage housing. So, you know what I'm saying? We're kind of thinking how it's always been, and we have this whole new paradigm, which is not how it's been. So, yeah, it's like, how do we achieve those things that we want in some semblance of where they're going to economically pencil out in order for people to actually do them versus like, forget about it. I can't do it, so I'll do this every single time. So I think we got to be careful that we're trying to, I think what we started out to do, which is realize it's going to be a little bit tougher for some of these types of housing, and we don't want to disincentivize somebody actually coming in and doing them.
Can I see that table again? Yeah, thanks. Cool. Yeah, okay, so just, we are consistent, like, I guess one thing to keep in mind also is like, we can, basically this is the same zone, but you just unlock more and more and more, right? Like, we're keeping the FAR the same. There's no reason you can't build like a bigger house in R3 than you can build in an R1. Like, we're kind of consistently saying that the envelope of like a 1-unit dwelling is like kind of consistent across all of the zones. 2-unit is also consistent, and then so I think that's nice. I think that like that sort of consistency across, like we're not making a zone where like for some reason the duplexes are bigger than than a different zone. So I think that is, I don't know, it's neat in some way. Like you can almost sort of define it the other, like another way around, where you're saying, okay, one family is limited to like this height, this area, this far, and then we're just allowing more kinds as well. Just wanted to double check on that consistency.
Yeah, but then you'll note it's all the same until you get to the affordability bonus. And we had a lot of debate about that, and it'd be interesting to hear from you too. We went to so they cap out at 1.4 at 6+ units. And then you go to 1.8 in R3 or 2.4 in R4 when you bonus. And this is effectively because you can get more height in R4, and that R4 is meant to be larger scale. And so we just went for it with the 2.4.
Okay, and so would affordability bonus then allow you to jump from like a duplex to a fourplex in a one person zone, or are we like incentivizing that differently?
Yeah, so it happens in R1 and R2 because they have density caps. When you get when you do affordability, you get the extra units, and therefore you get the extra area.
Okay.
But you can't really do that in R3 and R4 because you don't have a density cap. And so you need to give a little something more for that affordability bonus. You can't give units because they already have them, and so we give FAR.
I'd be really interested to hear the developer feedback on the affordability bonus, especially from affordable housing developers. Did they have comments on these numbers? Did they have comments on like, maybe we should be allowing bigger fourplexes, or, I can't imagine that would have worked out for them, but I'd be interested to hear how these impact feasibility for affordable housing.
Yeah, so we haven't talked with affordable housing developers yet, but we're going to. In other jurisdictions that I've worked in, essentially by allowing them to fit more units and have more density on the same lot, it basically can give them not an edge, but some competitiveness with market rate developers for purchasing the same lot because they can fit more units on. So it's less that a market rate developer would be building in like a mixed income development and getting the 2.4 or the 1.8 FAR bonus, but that the affordable housing developers would be benefiting from being able to build in more units. And then you also get more affordable units as well.
Okay, yeah, I'm really interested to hear their feedback on these numbers, because I feel like they this like a critical missing component of this incentivization that I don't know if we'll have time to get into the code, but I think that's like, I'm curious if we will have time to get their feedback into the code. It sounds like we're coming up on the end of the month and we start having the public hearing at that point, but I think they would be a really important partner in this.
Yeah.
Is it fair to assume that, for modeling purposes, R3 and R4, we're still using like 7,200 square feet? Is that? I mean, does it end up that way where the zones are, those average square footage?
R3 definitely has some 7,200 square foot because you're stepping up to town center using R3. R4 has much bigger lots, but it's still, because FAR scales with the lot size, you can still visualize how that scale may work out. And when we look at the visual examples of some of these where they're much bigger than 7,200 square feet, you can still see that 1.5 FAR, 50% lot coverage, like what it looks like on a larger lot.
Some of what's going through my head is just like unit counts, economic incentive, like to actually do these things. So the more, I don't know, maybe FAR accounts for that already. I'd have to think about that.
It's the beauty of FAR. It scales with the lot. Where it becomes a bit different than using a single infill lot is, like, say, as soon as you double the lot, but if you can share that driveway, you actually can build more units in the space. But if we don't offer more FAR, then it'll still be the same. It'll feel the same.
And I think we definitely want to incentivize the single driveway, right? It's that, to me, it's that balance of better design. We're not taking up on-street parking. We're not taking up area just with kind of needless driveway. It's better design. So that's what it also gives you, of just kind of helps hit some of those other things that have intention that we, over time, is going to make the development look and feel better than it would otherwise.
And so you can see on the last line on this slide, we're offering a 0.1 FAR for shared driveway on consolidated lots. That may want to say large lots of a certain size. We can think about what that should.
Yeah, for sure. Of where you're consolidating at least 2 lots of a certain size. And maybe even just the 4,800 square foot lots. Because even in that case, having a singular driveway as an incentive is far better than not, right? I mean, affordability wise of just putting the units in and not doubling that space that you're taking up. Design wise, pretty much everything you can imagine. If we kind of just continued on the path we were, it'd be like, townhomes, driveway, townhomes, driveway, you know, just like ad nauseum, and just trying to increment, not that we're precluding that, but we're also incentivizing maybe a better design along the way, which would be cool.
Anybody else?
It's just changing everything. Don't worry about it.
I can tell you that Tacoma took 2 years or so, and they are still very anxious about it. So I think these things do get revisited as you see how they perform.
Oh, absolutely. And even the legislation's all new, right? So does the legislation work as intended? And then do our standards work as intended? I mean, I think the proof is road testing it somewhat, right? And seeing what actually is working as intended. And, you know, is it more affordable? Are we going to get more affordable units? I don't know that any of us can answer that question for a little bit. Potentially, but.
Okay, so let me go. Thank you for the feedback. I know this is a lot. Let me move to open space, and then we'll talk about parking. Last time we met, you wanted to understand the rationale behind the requirements and some of the dimensions. Christie has said some of the existing townhouse requirements for 75 square feet of open space per unit has been easy to meet and developers are not objecting to it. So we went ahead and added that. If you remember, we didn't have much open space requirement. So that would be done for singles, slots, and rows. And then we're still giving the exception to incentivize stacks, saying that you don't need to provide open space. But that courts need that 20% that's required by the state for HB 1110 to count them as cottage housing. For dimensions, the model code recommends 15 feet minimum for shared open space. And so we've used that dimension. And then for private open space, you can fit a table and chairs in an 8-foot width. That's kind of represented on that right image. And then balconies, we thought 4 feet would be a good dimension. You can get a chair out there, a little side table, something like that. So pretty usable spaces, but not too huge. And that's the last slide from the standards. How does that feel to you?
I once read somewhere many years ago that balconies that are under 6 feet in depth rarely get used. Is that out of date now, or I imagine there's probably been some science since 20 or 30 years ago, or whatever it is that they wrote that.
I think that the bigger they are, the more usable they are. They're also much more expensive to build. So we're kind of striking a balance there.
Okay, and you still have the total amount of open space that you'd be looking at. So that would cover you.
Right.
And you can build them smaller, they just wouldn't count to this.
We are allowing balconies or porches of at least 30 square feet to count. But you still have to meet the 75 square feet somehow.
Okay. So you would like 3 of them.
Which is kind of what we've been doing for the mixed use provisions too. But what it does allow you is to get some more balcony space instead of kind of the Juliet thing of where you're trying to build in some more livability and still allowing density, right? That there are some areas of respite in different portions of a building. Versus, having to go out onto the sidewalk necessarily. So trying to make it usable, but also not trying to kill that we're not going to have certain types of development ever happen.
How much does this disincentivize courts?
Excellent, perceptive question. You could decide not to do that and not call it cottage housing per HB 1110. You are only required to select 6 of the 9 HB 1110 housing types. But the way HB 1110 defines cottage housing is with that 20%. And just by the way, we are lumping courts with courtyard housing and cottage housing, that they're around this shared open space, we're saying they need 20%.
Interesting. I don't know if I have an answer for that, but it does seem like there is some disincentive there to create this kind of housing that people seem to prefer. I like the framework that this is set up because you can sort of design anything and then you sort of, put it into the machine of like the 5 different types, and it kind of tells you what the regulations are based on important things like accessing the street, or are you accessing from a central area or something like that. I guess if that's from the state model code and we're applying it to courts, I wonder, is that inappropriate? Because we've sort of broken apart their framework and we've created our own that sort of ties back to what it is. But is the state model codes sort of courtyard housing and cottage courts analogous to just our defined access, like our definition of access from the central like from some central place rather than a street or a side of the yard.
The state doesn't go as far as saying where you have to access it from. They just say that those units are around a courtyard that's 20% of the lot. We're the ones saying you got to access, have nice looking facades on the courtyard side and the street side, and it needs to be these dimensions and adding more of the constraints.
Mm-hmm.
I will say after Commerce Review, they want everything to be defined, and they want us to be they want us to, if we use the term, that it has to be their definition. And we're not really using their term. We are a little bit. In cottage housing, there's the provision for the carriage houses, and that you can only have 6 per lot, or you must have 6 per cottage housing development.
Quick question on just something we talked about earlier with mid-block connectors. Can you get 2 in 1 for that with like cottage housing, in the sense that if you have something, a 7,200 square feet lot, 20%, that's 1,440, width is 16. If it's 90 feet long, that's the same. That's also 1,440.
I guess there's nothing saying you can't invite the public in through your courtyard.
Right, and it's just shared open space. Like everybody gives each other an easement, right? So,
Could. I think you could.
I think the state code, like this is an example of how the state code is overly prescriptive in a way that actually causes less middle housing, in our case. I guess we would need a workaround in some way. I don't know if, maybe there's some more test fits or something that, you can still meet the intent of, having a nice central open space that, is still like 20%, less than 20% of the lot. Like, this is a number I'm questioning, but it doesn't seem to fit with the other sort of numbers and the logic of the rest of this code. Which makes me think it could be a disincentive.
And model code is just that. It's model code. It's one size fits all.
Yeah.
Or fits most, or whatever. And it doesn't fit all, and it probably doesn't fit most. But we do have some flexibility in how we define stuff. Like Heidi said, we have to define at least 6 for the tier we're in, but we have some leeway with maybe how we define some of this other stuff to make it more applicable to Mountlake Terrace. And I think our goal is to make this applicable to Mountlake Terrace. Great that we have a state model code, but we have a state model code for everything. Right, and it does, and some things work and some things don't work.
So we can make up like a cottage housing that is.
We have to pronounce
more
it, okay?
flexible.
No.
Only felines allowed. I think there is enough creativity out there that if they feel like they want to do something like this and it's restrictive, they could probably call it a combination of slots and rows or something like that, and just do the open space they want to do.
Okay, yeah, I think there's, that's something where I would be, again, I think the numbers should be vetted, and like that's a number I think I would like to see vetted by the development community. If they can come up with, provable test fits or something that kind of shows it working, like, I think that's an important thing to look at.
yeah, I think you bring up a good point with like the feasibility on that cottage for the 20%. But then that's also what I was like thinking about. Can you do the mid-block thing, get a bonus on top of it to actually incentivize it? You'll get building area, increased setback reduction, and additional height, while meeting the cottage housing 20% rule.
Or you design it a certain way and it can satisfy your open space requirement or your common space requirement. So that's another thing we could do, right? We could incentivize that it goes to matches up to the alley, and you get bonus points for that.
Yeah, and then you have somebody build the parking corridor behind your cottage housing, and then they just drive their cars down your. I think we have ways of avoiding that.
Right.
But I would be interested to track how many of these things are built and which of the categories they fall into, because I feel like courts, while they're popular and I think they would be a really good urban design strategy, like if we're creating combinations of slots and whatnot, I think it might wind up not being used all that much. So as we're tracking incentives, I think it would be good to kind of track which ones are getting used and, you know, which of these categories are getting used, basically.
Okay. We have design standards to go through.
Parking was next.
Oh, parking, yes. Parking became exciting after being really straightforward with you. Parking always gets exciting. Okay, so last time we debated driveway standards and guest parking. And since then, some developments have happened. So Commerce reviewed, and then we have a new state bill. So we debated the driveway widths, as you see in that top bullet point, the aprons, and I think Christy can add more on driveways later, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, right now, it's looking like, in talking with South County Fire, we're probably around the 15-foot range, somewhere in the middle of this. Well, we're going to try to clarify it by tomorrow, so then we'll have more of a concrete definition for when we go to public hearing at the end of the month. But that's kind of where it's looking like it's landing right now.
Great. Okay. So SB 5184 is known as the Parking Reform and Modernization Act. It was just signed by the governor. Overall, it says a city may not require more than 0.5 stalls per multifamily unit. But it goes down to 0 for small units under 1,200 square feet. For 0 for affordable housing, 0 for senior housing, and some other uses you see listed there. That's a big change. If you remember, we were proposing 1 or 2 stalls per unit last time. So this applies to anything except single family. So we had to modify the parking standards to comply. We're saying, you know, just complying, as I read, singles 1,200 square foot or more, 1 stall. So that's the single family, larger houses, dwelling units under 1,200 square foot, 0. Affordable units, 0. Units within a half mile of a major transit stop, that's coming from HB 1110, 0. And then anything else, 0.5. These are not maximums. Right, so they have to provide that minimum, but there's no maximum, so developers and homeowners can still provide what they would like or what the market wants. Okay. We have this 12 feet per 15 feet of linear street frontage driveway comment, and then we are debating 18 feet per 60 linear feet. I think we're going to wait until the driveway stuff is solidified. Okay. That was it for parking. Okay, so the last section is design standards. Your comments last time were really mostly to be more prescriptive overall. We had spent the least time on them, the least time talking about them. You also requested the design standards for the improved parking courts, which we talked about, and mid-block connections, which I outlined earlier. And we talked about carriage houses. Overall, the council liked the housing types, which was great. And then they wanted to make sure the design standards supported affordability. That was a big comment. Okay, so we had quite a conversation about carriage houses last time. So we've increased the amount of carriage houses allowed to 1 per 3 units instead of 1 per 4 units. And this allows 2 carriage houses on a 6-unit development. We're saying 6 units is what you need to make a cottage housing development, so it just kind of made sense to use 3 as a multiplier. But they can be unlimited when they're accessed from the rear of the lot. You can see if alleys build up over time, that could make sense, or when retaining trees or adding connections. So it's kind of a bonus in a courtyard housing scenario where you get to build more carriage houses. Also heard your good comment about regulating the orientation of facades of the cottages that face both the street and the courtyard, and basically saying you have to use the street facing requirements even on the courtyard on both sides. This is an example of Pine Street cottages that shows the porches along the sidewalk and on the rear side in the courtyard, and that's what we're looking for. Briefly, on this one, we revised the garage setbacks from the rest of the facade based on your comments to 2 feet behind the narrow garages and then 4 feet behind the wider garages. That felt a little more consistent with what you've had. And then just saying that porches count. I'm seeing lots of nods, so hopefully that seems good. Okay, so then this is really the last topic, and it's a large one. There are about 4 slides to cover this topic. First, we've made the standards requirements throughout. They're not just suggestions. Second, we've added an applicability section that regulates the amount of minimum modulation or articulation required per a certain facade size. So you see facades under 40 have a certain amount of modulation or articulations, facades 40 to 80, and then facades 80 or more. Okay, so then you go to the next section of the code and you look up what those features are. But there's a new House bill, it was just an adventure with House bills, 1183, that affected our revisions. So they include modulation. So the moving in and out of facade planes can no longer be mandatory on several building types, including affordable housing, passive house buildings, conversions from one use into housing, or modular or mass timber construction. And so these would, essentially, there's an exception that they don't need to modulate, but they can replace with articulation features instead. Articulation features are a little more aesthetic, or material, or paint, repetition, things like that. So for those building types, they can swap with articulation features. Okay, so then the next one, these are the modulation requirements that basically can be selected for compliance. So we've updated the list to show required dimensions for each type of modulation. So we're saying designers should avoid excessive modulation that doesn't respond to these following conditions: expressing individual units, and then shifting those planes at least 2 feet, stepping back or insetting out to provide outdoor terraces at least 5 feet deep, insets at rooms or entrances 2 feet deep, and projected rooms or bay windows at least 2 feet deep and 5 feet wide. And so then there's the bottom example on the right is kind of an inset entry to a multiplex, and the top one is an example of every kind of modulation, and a lot of it not tied to particular uses. Okay, so let me go through the 2 articulation standards and then we can talk about it. This is part 1 of articulation features that they can choose from. So while the overall intent of many of the features were on the previous list, we've updated it quite a bit and have included dimensions to make them clearer and more objective. Essentially identifying primary entrances using these lists of things, repeating facade elements every 20 feet on minimum, including balconies, Juliet balconies, shading devices, stoops, porches, or distinct window combinations per see below. See below is basically combining or emphasizing windows using a change of material. We see this a lot in modern architecture right now, where there may be a window on the first floor and a window on the second floor, and you tie them together with some material on the inside. That's kind of a design move or an articulation move. And then part 2 includes a change of cladding materials, colors, or patterns, such as changing the base to contrast and complement the top, or vice versa, changing materials to differentiate units, We're saying they're limited to 3 per facade, exclusive of accent colors. That's something we kind of touched on last time, that you could choose to delete or not. If you feel like you're getting a lot of wild mixes of colors here and you want to limit it, you can. If you're feeling like that's not an issue, you could just delete this one. Windows with deep detailed frames, so they could be recessed deep from the cladding material. This is very rare now in light frame construction with hardy board. They use nail-on vinyl windows. They're very flush with the facade, and so this is an incentive to, or an articulation thing, simply to just set your windows back like we used to do. Or providing a kind of a flashing surround that's proud of the cladding and makes the window look deeper, or adding a decorative trim. This is another one that doesn't get used a lot lately, but just simply using face brick with a deeper 2-inch depth as a cladding material on most of the facade. You see a lot of older middle housing in the Seattle region that just uses brick, not a lot of detail, has those deep windows because brick, the frame of the wall is behind the brick, and so the window is already deep. And with just a couple other, like an inset entry or one of the other articulation features, is quite a nice building. And then the last one's expressing roof forms, including sloping roofs like gables and sheds, or stepping backward or forward a bit with the roof, having a strong cornice line, or overhanging. We see a lot of boxes, so these aren't being used a lot in many, but they could be. Okay, so those are the design standards. The rest of them remain as they were in the proposal. We didn't hear a lot of comments from you last time. We've moved a couple things around into different categories, but they're basically the same. Thoughts on these?
Is there any sense of like kind of the additional cost burden? Because on one hand, this is great. On the other hand, makes it desirable and prices go up. And then maybe it's more expensive to build too. So is there like a cost delta, a sense of a cost delta for a developer between a box versus a more articulated, modulated building?
I don't have hard data. I don't know if you do, Mackenzie. I mean, as a practicing architect, I think the biggest costs are moving facade planes, more modulation things, and that's why the state is saying you cannot mandate this for affordable housing anymore. So that's a big one. Material change, you've got to clad your building in something. So changing from a equal cost product to another equal cost product is a little bit more because there's a detail between the two, but not that much. We're not saying brick is required or deep windows are required. We're saying if you do these things that are less flashy or look like changes, you can still count them as articulation, but it's not a requirement. Those two things are they're more expensive. In some codes, you're not even allowed to do that. You have to modulate, you have to articulate colors and materials, and they don't allow for more simple buildings like the brick with deep windows. So I tried to propose things that were, pretty varied from each other, like give more choices, things that are material and color choices, things that are just about repetition of things you already have to put on the building, like stoops. So I don't have hard numbers, but I'm trying to be kind of flexible so that lots of possibilities are there. And then the number that are required, so facades less than 40 feet wide, one modulation could be insetting an entry. They've got to cover their entry already. So one move, or pulling one townhouse forward and pushing one house back. That's all they have to do.
Got it.
And then 2 articulations could be repeating a balcony or wrapping a window and trim or something like that. So they're not big.
Right.
And then up to 80 feet wide, you're basically doubling that number because it's double the building.
Yeah, no, I like that explanation. To me, it sounds like we want micro variety, but macro repetition. like in the sense of like 20 feet, repeat these elements, but you have flexibility in what you do with that building. So I think as long as that macro consistency is there, I find that that's like, it almost doesn't matter what it is, but if it's like consistent, much like the grids we were talking about with the connectors and the alleys, like that kind of proportionality agreement. It's just a little bit top of mind for me because being just on more the private side, labor is so expensive here. So any kind of variations on it, I'm just a little bit sensitive to like the additional labor costs because we're short on labor here.
Sure. I would just put a plug in for what I call the overpainting of America. Hey, I got a great design idea. How about 3 colors? How's that grab you? It grabs me every single time because everybody proposes it. So to me, you know, things can get painted over and that element goes away. So is it really that big of a design change? I would just say no. And I feel like Heidi has a good example of the topsy-turvy house as that, please don't do this where you're just kind of going crazy. I would say the same is the painting thing just kind of has been used ad nauseum as a design element. We used to have like put a medallion on the side of the building, and that's one design element that went away as an allowance too, because I was just like, oh, please. Because I mean, a lot of times if it's a cost thing, then yeah, people are going to be looking for affordability, but I would say Heidi and her team's done a really good job, I think, of making this very doable as far as middle housing goes, and still trying to just not, making sure we just don't have like nondescript box everywhere.
That was going to be my comment too. You know, the state once again is stepping in and handcuffing us and dictating what we can and can't do. And I see this and I'm just like, all we're going to get is stark boxes. So anything that we can do to mitigate that and to encourage some actual thought, intentionalness in the design, I think is important. I mean, I understand where they're coming from on it, you know, as a cost issue, but when you just see building after building with just flat facades, monotonous design, it really, I mean, it kind of brings things back to the public space. It really changes the feel of that public space when you're dealing with that kind of design element. You're just like,
Another one. Yeah.
And so, I'll stay polite with my comments about the state, but yeah, anything that we can do to sort of mitigate that, and you know, obviously be compliant with their rules, but still try and achieve the design aesthetic that we're shooting for.
Yeah. So I'd actually come out the other way and say I don't like regulating design aesthetic. I think that it tends to create weird architecture more than it creates good architecture. I think, you know, I would prefer to see these more as guidelines, but I might be outweighed on the commission here. Could we go back to the table that you had, or the list that you had? Yeah, there we go. So I think, like, the main reason I would consider, like, I think the main reason people like modulation is because they want a building that takes up more than like one lot's width of building to look like it's multiple buildings, sort of like it's a historic town where you've got, you know, somebody built one building and then they built another building next to it and they redeveloped. And so you've got this kind of continual street wall of all these different buildings. So I think the numbers that you've provided where you start actually requiring modulation without any articulations kind of makes sense. I would probably put articulations first as opposed to modulations, because I think that's going to be, like, the way I'm reading it, like, the kind of intent is like, oh, maybe you're pushing and pulling the facade, but like, I think what is, you know, actually maybe more flexible is sort of the articulations. And I think that's kind of where we might start having more power and more interest. Like, I think the articulation list that we've created is incomplete. Like, I would argue that a mural is probably an articulation. Like, if you create a big blank thing and you put a big mural in it, like you go to downtown Edmonds, or I was in St. Pete, Florida recently, and they have murals all over the place that are incentivized by the city. Like, I think there are other things that could qualify as articulations. Are we going through administrative design review? I don't think we have any design review.
You have
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, we have administrative now, and we're required to, the state law requires administrative review now.
Okay, and we didn't have design review before?
We do, but it's always been administrative.
Okay.
And
All
I've
right.
always fought for
Yeah.
Yeah.
more.
Okay. Well, I think there should be some process by which you can propose new articulations or modulations. Like, I think people will come up with things like murals or something that might be worthwhile to add into this. So that way, I think we get more flexibility, and over time, we come up with all these sort of design strategies that hopefully people have implemented successfully that we can pull from.
Do you think the list is okay as it is for now? You're just looking for that variance kind of thing, or, you know, flexibility? Or are there some you would add other than mural?
I mean, mural is the one that I came up off the top of my head, and I think the timeline is so compressed that we probably can't sit around thinking of more. But I think having a process by which we can add them will help as we look at this in the future.
I like the concept of murals. It's something that I've always talked about, especially as a design standard, especially in the town center. I don't know if I want the murals, though, to have that count as one of the boxes that they can check off on this. I also normally, just from what I've experienced where I've seen murals, I usually see murals on the blank facade, on the side facades of like mixed use buildings, you know, larger buildings. I generally don't see them, you know, in kind of the lower scale townhome type development. Not to say that they wouldn't necessarily happen there, but usually I see it on on the larger flat sides of the building that are only flat because the assumption is that something's going to be built right next to it that's eventually going to cover the mural up.
Yeah. I mean, we do have a mural house like that's pretty prominent. I mean, the artists live there, but like, you know, I think that is a thing that we do find in our neighborhoods, though.
I have to see this house. I've heard about it twice.
I know, me too. I want to see it.
It's right there on the corner, 58th and 236. You'll go right by it if you're going to the freeway.
Well, there's a couple more now, right? So we have more than one in single-family residential, so.
So Christy brought up the idea that you can just paint over colors and that it should not count as articulation. So we have D, change of cladding materials, colors, or patterns. Should we keep color included, or should this be struck to only be materials or patterns?
I think it should just be materials and patterns. Color can be changed too easily.
And if they have
That's
a proposal, and if they have a proposal, otherwise that might work, they can propose it through our addition process that we'll add.
Yeah. For an example, for Snohomish County, the Urban Center Design Review Guidelines it says it has to be of a different material type. Encourages like rustification, at the base level. And then when you move up, you start to see the color palette of hardy board siding that keeps getting proposed.
Hardy does make different profiles, so
Yes,
they can
it
switch
does.
to a lap or a flat. Okay, I think that's an easy one to do. Any other comments?
More of a question, going back to the very beginning of the presentation when we were talking about sort of the design standards for the mid-block connections and how, that's kind of a bigger lift and, we can do that as a follow-up. maybe this is just more of having a conversation between you and Christy, just to get an idea how long that follow-up would take, and when could we find it in the near-term schedule? I know our schedule's crazy. Just so it doesn't sort of fall through the cracks and, 2 years down the line, we still haven't touched it.
What I'd like to propose is that we initiate something right now, because at least we can get started, and then we can add to it. So the rest of this year after this is the other parts of the zoning we need to update per the comp plan, and we have critical areas, and we have a couple other things. So that's pretty shot, plus some transportation stuff. Then we talked about getting into some sub-area work next year. We could add addition to, but I would say let's try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and get a start right now, and then we can look to refine it. At least that gets us going. Does that work for everybody?
If you guys have the capacity to throw something
Heck,
together.
yeah. I'm just thinking we're kind of partly there. So let's at least start that. And then if we want to add to it and refine, we can. But like I said, every development that gets done, you've lost an opportunity.
And that's my
for-
biggest concern.
Yeah.
I already look at it, we already have lost that opportunity for everything that's already happened in the last few years. And
Right,
so
right.
Anything that's going to break ground moving from today forward, I want to make sure.
And some people are waiting for this to happen. So I think, if we can try to put some of that in right now, then that just gives us a jump start.
It sounds like you guys said you might be willing to throw something together for us, but will we have a chance to review it before we actually do the public hearing on this?
Yeah, we can try to get them something before the public hearing, and then we'll put it in the materials for the public hearing.
Are we still sort of set on having the public hearing the next meeting? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to. And the reason why is council wants 2 work sessions and then a public hearing. And there's nothing that prohibits the planning commission from attending work sessions and kind of continuing to follow. But we have to have this adopted before the end of June. So I would say, let's try to get in what we can. And then, we can go back and take a closer look. I'm also advocating to try to get the PED and trail stuff on the docket coming up here as well, because I think it really ties into the work that needs to be done overall. That ties everything together, streetwise, land use wise, all the stuff we talk about. That's kind of a missing component that we need to do.
It's exciting.
All right. Great. Just double checking with all our online planning commissioners. Any other questions or comments on this?
No questions, and now I know what you're talking about for the mural house. I pass that thing every day. I don't even think about it anymore.
I thought you had.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
All right, so I guess we'll move on to item number 6 then, director's report.
All right. Just sharing with you folks, you can see where we're at. I think that's important. And moving a recommendation forward, but like I said, as part of that work, just if wanting to stay engaged, because I would imagine there's going to be a few tweaks in the draft as well. And then you guys are also working on the next up, the housing action plan. So you can see where some of that work was done, as you guys know, as part of the comp plan. I think a great deal of that work was done. This is an effort just to kind of refine some of that goal and policy language to be more proactive at what we need to do here. So you're going to be working on that, and at the same time, starting this summer, you guys are going to start to see some of that update to the critical areas ordinance for wetlands, frequently flooded areas, wildlife habitat areas, hillside areas, all those things that we need to protect. And one of the requirements is keeping up with what's called best available science. So we're doing that work right now to see where our current code falls short potentially, and then what amendments we need to make to that code. The code was last updated back in 2019. So there shouldn't be a great deal of change to that, but nonetheless, it's part of that review and just making sure that we're staying compliant with state law. In addition, the city is having a State of the City event on May 21st from 6 to 8 o'clock here at City Hall. And the city is requesting RSVPs. I know that the mayor is going to speak and the city manager, and there's going to be some refreshments and that type of stuff. So I just wanted to remind all of you that that is going to be taking place. It seems so far away, and now it's May 21st, and I'm like, what day is it? So that's right around the corner. And that's been planned for quite some time. So just an update kind of on what everybody's doing will be a part of that, including the work that you guys are doing and planning on doing and have done as well. So anyways, just FYI, if you would like to attend that as well. So we'll try to get some information to you before, like I said, just kind of trying to get everybody on the same page with some of the other changes that we're doing as part of this effort. And then just realizing, in addition to the housing action plan, we have some additional zoning that we need to get done. So you guys are going to be busy with all of these things. And I would just remind everybody, including myself, that this is kind of a wholesale change of essentially changing most every zoning district we have in the city. And that feeds into a lot of different things. So just realizing that there's all this initial work that needs to be done, and then there's definitely going to need to be follow-up. But part of that follow-up is going to be when we actually sit down to implement some of these things. Is it really working as we intend to? So that's going to be really important. And the state changed a lot of the regulations that we were working on before we've adopted them and other people have adopted them. So there's kind of that thing that's going on too. So even before you have a chance to adopt something, we're seeing where some things are going to get changed. I don't know if that's going to persist next year as well, but I would just say we'll just have to stay vigilant and see what the legislature is up to as part of this. So
I would say it's safe to assume that some of the cities that have the means are going to push back on what's been passed and maybe lobby to have revisions for next year.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting because I think also we're hearing, you know, how other jurisdictions are handling some things. And I think at the end of the day, it's good to get information from other jurisdictions and see what other people are doing and learn from them. But also, just like I said previously, there's model ordinances and all those different types of things. And that's great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an exact fit for where we live and our circumstances. And so I think we have to always realize that we're going to comply with the intent of the law, but we're going to try to make it fit Mountlake Terrace the best we can without getting taken to the hearings board or being out of compliant with the law, because that affects any type of grant funding and other things that the city doesn't. I wouldn't recommend that the city go down that path. So, you know, we'll do the best we can, meeting the intent, but realize you guys, a lot of you guys know this city better than anybody else, right? You know it better. So we just have to make decisions based on what you know about the community. That's why there's a planning commission, so, and a council. So anyways, that's all I have. We have a new planner coming on the 27th, Emma, and coming to us from Arizona. So they will start then, and you guys will have an opportunity, I'm sure, in some capacity. And then Sarah Pizzo, our senior planner, is working on the update to the critical areas ordinance, so she'll be in here working with you guys. All right, any questions for me about anything that's going on?
I also heard we got a new economic development director.
Oh, we do. I'll invite Ryan, see if Ryan could come to our next planning commission. Ryan Doss is his name. I believe Ryan's been here. Shannon, I'm looking at you, 3 or 4 weeks? He's been here since Friday before he was hired. Oh, okay. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, Ryan's been here. He's down sitting in our department in CED, so we're slowly corrupting him to become one of CED. So we're trying to work Ryan is working on branding for the city. So that's a big effort, which is great. And then just working on economic development strategies and putting together all of that stuff. Comes via the city of Dallas and worked in economic development, and a super nice guy. So he's here, he has a family, they'll be coming shortly, I believe, after school gets out, and they'll be moving this way, so.
You mentioned he's working on branding for the city. Is there any way we can sort of parlay that into the branding for the neighborhoods as well?
I told him about that and that we should be having a conversation about that.
Okay.
So they are going to be doing an RFP, and I was told that I could review that, and I told him kind of where we're at with that branding, sub areas, and potentially at least maybe considering as part of that process naming conventions of sub areas even, and kind of that's part of the work. But it's also going to involve signage and, you know, all different types of things. So I think, yeah, that would be very important. So we'll invite Ryan to come introduce himself and tell you guys about where he's at. You guys will also be seeing an update from engineering as well coming up here. So, but first things first on getting our draft put together and getting those draft ordinances put together. So that's the big push in the next couple of weeks.
Gotcha.
And reminder that we're at Memorial Day, and the next meeting is that Tuesday versus the Monday, since Monday's a holiday.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions for staff?
Sorry, I had one more. Just kind of curious what's going on with Candela and some of the other work down by the transit center. I know we probably haven't had time for an economic development update in a bit, but because we've just been flying through the code. But I was curious.
Candela is revising their civil permit based on once the temporary parking lot was removed, they were able to do some additional test borings. So they're revising their stormwater And my understanding is they're intending to mobilize late summer, early fall at this point. And then you might have seen passing by, there was a bunch of graffiti on the wall.
That was going to be my next question.
And our crack code compliance officer, Laura Stevenson, was on that, and that got taken care of.
I saw that I saw a city crew working on the graffiti on 236. What about the graffiti that was on the private property?
That's been taken care of.
Taken care of? Okay.
Yeah. And apparently there's just a rash of people with spray paint around the city everywhere. And so there's been some social media and website of just reporting that, trying to get a handle of, it's just kind of been really bad lately in the city
Yeah.
for some reason.
It's
So-
one of those cases where if you give them an inch, they're going to take a
Yeah,
mile.
yeah.
And like, I know just because of city resources, it's like you can't necessarily be out there, like somebody reports it and you can't be out there within the hour.
Right.
But the longer it stays, the more it invites
Oh, sure.
people to keep doing it or more people to come and add to it.
Yeah,
And I mean, you just see what's happening down, on the freeway or in, parts of Seattle. It's just, it's
yeah,
awful.
yeah. So we're trying to, Laura's typically out every day in various capacities. So we're trying to get as much of a handle on that as we can. But yeah, it's been pretty bad lately. And then just being proactive to getting it cleaned up. So.
Okay. One last check with everybody, especially online. Any questions for staff?
No question.
Okay, not hearing any, so we'll go ahead and move on to item number 7, miscellaneous business by call of planning commissioners. Anybody have any miscellaneous business? I've got one. So when I was booking my travel, I forgot that Memorial Day was when it was, on a Monday. And so I booked my flight on a Tuesday thinking I would avoid traveling on the day of a planning commission. I thought I was good. Silly me. So I will be in DC for our next meeting.
Okay.
It is logistically hard to hold a public hearing via Zoom when everybody else is
Yeah.
in person. I will try, barring any technical glitches. So I'm just putting it out there. If I have a problem connecting or anything, just vice chair, be prepared to step up if needed. We haven't done this before where we've had a public hearing where we've had a mix of people here in person and online where I'm not the one who's in person. I see you have your laptop here. I would ask if you're in person, if you have a laptop or some other device, it would probably be helpful to bring it. That way you can at least log into the meeting so I can see when you have a question or you want to raise your hand, you can do it through the meeting and that way I can see it. Otherwise, when I'm watching online for the, the meetings, I'm looking for visual cues. Usually I can just look at you or I'm having to remember to look at the screen. But if you're here and you're wanting to ask a question and I can't tell because like staff is talking, and so the camera's on staff.
Right.
I'm not seeing, even if you're like waving your hand, I'm not going to see it. So maybe if you're able to do that, that's great. If not, we maybe figure out some logistical issues or somebody could just say, hey, we have somebody who wants to speak.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
can
I
do
was
that.
going to recommend maybe I could bring it to your attention.
Okay, that's great. New territory, so,
Okay.
figuring it out on the fly. I'm more concerned about just even being able to attend.
Sure.
Logistically, being that it'll be like 11 o'clock at night in the hotel room.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a cheap hotel room, so who knows what I'm sure there isn't going to be any kind of Wi-Fi they're offering, so it's going to be whatever I can muster off of a cell phone, so.
Okay.
It's going to be tricky.
If you've got that language of opening and closing the public hearings, please send that to me so I can use it.
Well, we can get you some.
Yeah.
Okay,
We'll get
great.
that to you, Commissioner Betcher.
There is a script, and it's a good, I'll bring it up too. it'd be helpful to have that script ahead of time, because I know sometimes it's just here in, in person. So if I can have that
Yes,
ahead of
got
time
it.
too. And then I know just from looking at the script that it's just the one that the city council uses. And I have to make mental notes to say planning commission. So if you have that, if you can maybe quickly edit a version.
Yeah, we used to have a planning commission one. We'll revise it
Okay.
specific to this, to also make sure that we're getting all the components of what we're recommending, so what we're repealing, and then,
Yeah, that would be helpful too,
and
'cause I
those
know
type of things,
That's what we used to have.
and adopting.
I'll
Okay,
just timeline reference. Back in the temporary building, I know that's what we used to have, and I know lately we've just sort of had the generic script from city council that doesn't really change from, and so you kind of, especially if we need to, it's not only what the recommendation should be, but like if we have to do something, if we're making an additional recommendation the
exactly.
night of,
Yep.
it's how we're phrasing that.
Yep.
How that's going to be added. So
yeah. So what we can do is kind of maybe do an itemized for the different things that we're doing per ordinance, and that might be very helpful. So,
And I'm just keeping my fingers crossed, knocking on wood, that there aren't going to be any kind of technical glitches. But
okay, if
I know
so,
in
Adam.
January, when I was out of town, I was able to get into the meeting, but it was a little bit of a struggle.
Okay,
So
all right,
I'm just trying to plan for worst case scenario.
okay. Yeah, and I would just say making sure we have a quorum is really important, that we have at least 4, so. And also just so everybody can make sure that they are on board with recommending what the planning commission is recommending. So,
And especially since they're going to be presenting some stuff in the interim that we haven't had a chance to discuss.
right,
all of this.
yeah.
Will there be an opportunity, like, to discuss that before before we open the public hearing, or would that discussion on the new stuff need to take place during the public hearing as well?
Yeah, I mean, what we could do is just go over any of the additional changes that have been made, and then we can open up the public hearing portion of it based on that. And then what we would have to do is then, if we want to, if planning commission wants to make changes per your discussion, then when those motions come up for those particular things, we can add or, propose to make changes that get forwarded to council.
Would it be helpful, since you guys are going to really do the Herculean task of trying to put something together for us to review in the interim, if we can sort of return the favor and provide, if we see something that there's a comment, concern, or we'd like, nope, not this instead, relay that comment back to you. That way, when it comes to the meeting, you can say, we gave it to you, this is some of the feedback we heard back from you guys.
Absolutely, that'd be great.
Because sometimes that is easier to have you guys, take a look at that and sort of
Right.
wordsmith it and really be succinct about, okay, this is what we heard. And then saying, hey, does everybody else feel this way, or is the majority fine with what was presented? And then hopefully that will sort of, I don't want to say limit discussion, I'm not trying to limit discussion, but be more efficient with our pre-hearing discussion, since it's sometimes when we're looking at something new for the first time, it's a little messier than by the time we get to a public
Yeah,
hearing. Where
certainly.
maybe looked at it 3 different meetings over the course of 2 or 3
Right.
months.
You
We're gonna
can
be
think
looking at-
about it.
This is
Yep.
going to be the first time we're going to have a chance to talk about it.
Yeah, if we can get something to you by the end of this week and then get the materials by like midweek next week would be nice. And then everybody could also have an opportunity just to take a look at everything. So we'll do the best we can in getting that done.
And then I guess the only follow-up that I would have then is, so for right now, do we have any people who've already requested an excused absence for that meeting? No? Okay.
All
Fingers
right.
crossed everyone's there.
Yeah, be great.
Anybody else? Any miscellaneous business? I am not hearing or seeing any, so I'll go ahead and declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.